Fragile squirrel Birdie was born among lions. She lived in the house of her cruel aunt since birth. Her only friend was her future groom, the second prince. But after she decided to give it all up for her dream, he killed her. She woke up in the past, before she met the prince. What is the most important thing in times like these? That's right, speed. She fled in an instant, slipping into her father's domain. She is not welcome here, but she will go to the end to uncover a terrifying secret, after which she will never be thrown out. She was definitely dying, and definitely lying in a pool of her own blood. Never could the girl have imagined that people she considered close would treat her this way, but alas, they said goodbye to her without blinking an eye. But now for some reason she was in the palace. And her age. She was reborn after death and returned to her youth girl. At that moment she was going to bow to the descendant of the white snake, and she was asked to be very respectful. At last they reached the appointed place, and what was Squirrel's surprise when she saw him in front of her? It was Ritter, the first crown prince whom she was going to marry. What is going on here? Why is he here? This is the man who stood there and watched her die, and he had the same sly, mysterious smile on his face as he does now. What a twist! The powers that be are giving her a chance to change everything. When he saw Squirrel, the young man smiled even wider and asked the girl if they knew each other. Did he really not recognize her? Did he not recognize the victim he killed, or was he pretending very well? After all, she had once truly loved him. Birdie remembers very well how her mother yelled at her as a child not to look at the boy with beautiful blonde hair. After all, it was Crown Prince Ritter himself. But then she didn't care at all, even if he was the emperor himself. Her killer again? Well, let's see what this is all about and what comes of it. The prince saw that the girl was worried, so he tried to calm her down. It was not scary at all that she was not from the race of snakes, but from the lower class of squirrels. They would be good friends, despite all the rules and regulations. Indeed, Ritter treated Birdie with genuine kindness and understanding for many years. He did not care at all about the fact that they had a huge difference in status and background. He enjoyed spending time with the girl and caring for her, and she believed him. She loved him for many years, until the moment when her dream began to come true. Then everything changed. His attitude became cold, arrogant, and at one point he simply decided to kill her, biting Birdie's neck. Since childhood, the girl was alone. Her mother died very early, and she was given to be raised by a harmful and always evil aunt. Birdie's only salvation was books. She read everything in a row to somehow distract herself from the cruelty of the world. Farina Sirius, Birdie's aunt, was a mean and blunt woman. Perhaps she had become that way because of her hard fate, but she was terribly irritated by the fact that her niece was playing the fool, sitting all day long at some book. One morning the woman appeared in the girl's room and told her in a cold tone to get ready. They had to go, although Birdie had no idea where they were going. Usually no one invited her anywhere. The auntie put on an evil smile and said that it was time for her to be useful to the family that feeds her and gives her a roof over her head. It turned out that the first prince wanted to marry her, and this was a great success. Having completely forgotten to ask the girl if she agreed to such an adventure, Farina turned around and ordered Birdie to follow her. On the way, she reminded him that the girl should consider the prince her future husband and serve him faithfully. What followed was a series of moral lectures. Birdie must always bow before His Majesty. Remember to speak respectfully and quietly. Be sure to speak clearly and distinctly, and not dare to contradict him in anything. It seemed as if Birdie was about to meet not a human being, but some kind of monster, and this was quite stressful for the girl. After all, the prince was about the same age as she was, so why all the pathos? The aunt couldn't calm down. It didn't even occur to her to ask the girl if she was ready for such a step, and if she needed this prince at all. And she didn't need him. She was so scared that Birdie didn't imagine a boy, but a real monster. Farina asked her not to forget that this was not just a boy. This was the emperor's son, and in his veins flowed not ordinary blood, but the blood of a white snake. Therefore, once and for all, Birdie must remember that she was of a lower class. All the girl's fears were dispelled during her acquaintance with Ritter Astrum. The crown prince turned out to be not so scary, but even a very nice boy. He asked Birdie not to worry and to behave as usual. At the beginning of their acquaintance, she was so frightened that she didn't even think to extend Ritter's hand to shake. He doesn't look like the man she was warned about. Where is the tyrant and the arrogant heir? The boy took the girl's hand himself and shook it gently, and then his eyes widened. He looked closely at the sign that was depicted on Bertie's wrist. It was the first time he had seen such a thing. It was a signum, a special sign that the higher powers awarded only to the chosen ones. Only the chosen ones of the constellations were born with such a symbol. It was an image of a fragment of a star that was considered magical. Usually people were proud of having a sign on their body from higher powers, but for some reason Bertie was ashamed of her symbol. She always tried to hide it under the sleeve of her clothes. And now the prince saw the image on her wrist. The young man saw the girl's reaction and how she was trying to hide her symbol. He smiled and said that her sign was very beautiful and that the girl was embarrassed about it in vain. Bertie's eyes grew a little confident from these words. Ritter took the girl's hand again and looked her straight in the eyes. He asked her if she understood that from now on he would always be on her side and would protect her in any case. But how could that be? She didn't deserve such treatment. From that moment on, the boy with blonde hair became her only friend. She married him and thought that she and the prince would become even closer to each other. But she was wrong. Her world turned upside down and collapsed. Farina said that the girl would study in a completely different place, and these classes were not at all simple. The woman simply used the lessons to take complete control of the girl's life. Beautiful and expensive clothes, delicious food and exquisite drinks, high society and boring small talk. All this was alien to Bertie. She could not get used to such a life, but it wasn't all that bad. She found an abandoned attic where a lot of books, interesting magazines, and newspaper clippings were kept. And now, at every opportunity, the girl ran here to distract herself. And there was another interesting fact that few people knew. At the behest of higher powers, Bertie could easily turn into a squirrel. Therefore, she often took advantage of this privilege and made her way into the garden to bask in the sun. Sometimes the prince would ask how she was doing. When he saw a book in her hands, he would ask what she was reading. And Bertie read everything. Right now she was studying the Book of Laws. After all, in the future, the girl dreamed of becoming a trader and seeing the whole world. The girl thought she was perfect for the role. She would travel. And there was an unwritten rule among traveling salesmen: sell your shame for a handful of coins. As her aunt said, that suited Bertie. She couldn't imagine living her whole life in one place. It was rather boring. She needed to see the whole world. That was her cherished dream. Of course, no one supported her idea, but Bertie didn't care about others. The worst part was that Ritter didn't want to listen to Bertie's nonsense at all. She was the future queen. Why would she want to trade the most important title in the country for the role of a traveling saleswoman? For a long time, the girl did not know how to talk about this topic with the prince, but one day she decided and simply asked if Ritter wanted to marry her. After all, he certainly does not like it. It is just what his mother wants. They are just friends, and true friends should help each other, and above all, be honest. So maybe they should come up with something to avoid this stupid wedding that neither she nor the prince needs. The prince looked sadly at the girl and smiled. He also dreams of many things, but alas, no one is interested in his dreams. He is of royal blood and must follow all the customs and rules of his family. But how happy were Bertie's eyes when she heard that Ritter was ready to help her realize her dreams. It turned out that he really was a true friend and understood her like no one else. At least one person in this world wanted to help her. One evening, the girl called the prince into her room and told him that she had a plan to escape from the imperial palace. She would escape from here and finally fulfill her long-time dream, to become a merchant. Ritter listened to the girl attentively and said that he would help her in any way he could, he had promised. But first, everything had to be checked thoroughly and prepared in detail. Everything had to go so that no one would suspect that they had acted together. During the conversation, the prince called Bertie a princess several times, but she is not a princess. She has a ducal status. But the guy said that this is for now, and let her just trust him, then everything will go well. The girl calmed down a little, and the guys began to develop an escape plan, going through all possible nuances. There was a lot of work because they needed to outwit all the guards of the imperial palace. Everything had to be thought out down to the last detail. How to save money, where to find cheap housing for Birdie, which academy to enter in order to get a good education and spend a minimum of money. When the plan was fully drawn up, it turned out that they would not be able to do much because of their age. They had to wait until they came of age, and only then implement everything they had planned. But the wait was worth it. Time flew by, and the day arrived when Birdie turned 18. Ritter appeared in her room. He came to say goodbye to the girl and wish her luck. At first glance, that's what it seemed to the girl. But instead of warm words and wishes, there was silence. The prince was silent. He leaned close to the girl's neck. And then something terrible happened. He bit her hard. Birdie managed to push the guy away. She was scared, so she asked him why he did that, why he bit her. Then the girl looked more closely and saw fangs in the crown prince's mouth instead of teeth. Of course, Ritter didn't explain anything, and Birdie felt her strength leaving her. Blood was running down her neck, and she couldn't stand on her feet. She fell to the floor, right in front of the prince who was standing next to her. Quick steps were heard, and someone entered the room. When the girl raised her head a little, she saw her own aunt standing next to Ritter. What was she doing here? Why was she whispering to her friend? Birdie gathered her strength and began to ask for help. She was noticed, and the prince leaned toward her in a minute. But, to her regret, it was not to help. He was cold and focused. The next minute he took her wrist. Then he jerked the girl's arm and pulled back her sleeve to reveal the symbolic sign. The signum stone was in place, adorning Birdie's wrist. The next second he tore it out of the body of his now ex-girlfriend like a bait. It was as if her whole life flashed before the girl's eyes. Her first meeting with Prince Ritter, their conversations, friendship, and his promise to always and under any circumstances support her and help her in everything. And now Birdie was lying half-fainting on the floor in a pool of blood, and the prince was standing next to her, not even paying attention to the girl's suffering, giving her the opportunity to die. He was telling her aunt something, but everyone, fortunately, forgot that the girl had a special gift. She can turn into a squirrel. Now it's time to use it for good purposes, just to escape from this terrible place and traitors. Very quickly, she reached the market square and sat down on a carriage that was heading north of the empire to Aslan's province. She hid upstairs and waited for departure. No one would have paid attention to her anyway. This is not how she imagined escaping from the imperial palace. She had a completely different plan which she developed together with the prince, but what happened happened, and there is no way back. Only forward. She returns to the places where she was born and raised. The journey will be long. She is left alone, without friends, help, and any thoughts on how to act further. But she will definitely think about it, and then she will take revenge on the prince. The aunt was furious. She had never expected that her niece could use the power of transformation and escape from them. She shouted after the girl that she would get what she deserved when she returned, and the prince understood that the squirrel was not going to return. The woman did not calm down, because she had completely different plans for her niece. It seemed that she was about to burst from anger. She felt awkward in front of the prince because she had screwed up the whole thing. And the prince stood aside and looked at the woman without any emotion. After all, it was she who had thought it all up and organized the meeting between Ritter and Birdie, and now, because of her, their whole plan was going down the drain. Now it looked exactly as if the woman had seized the perfect opportunity for her to deprive the prince of any opportunity to fight for the throne and take his brother's side. The woman fell to her knees and began to beg for mercy. What did the prince think of? She was originally loyal only to him, and there was no evil intent in her actions. She had been devoted to Ritter for many years. Farina promised the prince that she would quickly correct the situation. She would not allow evil rumors to spread throughout the capital, and no one would know about the incident. The prince had little faith in the woman, but in the current situation, he had no other choice. He asked Farina to settle everything as quickly as possible. Dasha said that he was ready to give access to the crystal ball if necessary. While in the capital, Auntie and the prince were looking for a way to get Birdie back, the girl was already in the north of the country. At that moment, she was standing near the entrance doors of Aslan's central castle. She had finally arrived here. Here she will gather her thoughts and of course take cruel revenge on Ritter for betraying her. He is always wary of his brother. And if the second prince is still alive, then this chance is worth taking advantage of. Well, then the girl remembered that by the will of higher powers, she returned to the past again. She is only 8 years old, which means the second prince is still alive. But the problem is that he is always on the battlefield, and finding him will be quite a task. You have to be very careful. Signum is very rare and expensive, so many will want to steal it. She herself is still very young and weak, and her chances of survival are very small. Therefore, it is worth thinking carefully about each step. One day, the girl overheard important information for herself that under the command of Duke Aslan, the royal army defeated the Holy Empire in the very first battle. This was great news for the squirrel. If things continued at this rate, the Great War that had been going on for many years would finally end, and she would be able to find a way to meet the second prince. 10 years ago, the Great War seemed to be coming to an end. Well, everything happened exactly the opposite. An event occurred that put the imperial army to flight. It was the first retreat of the Golden Lion, who had always won before. After this event, the war lasted for another 10 long years, entailing many human losses. But everything can change if the second prince learns his future, and Bertie will help him with this. The Golden Lion, Duke Leonhart Eld Aslan, must know the truth. He was an incredibly smart and brave man. It was not for nothing that his army always won any battle, but this man's fate was not easy. Although she was a princess, she had no family. She knew no one who could be called her father. This man never visited her and never answered any of her letters. Only once did she receive a regular invitation to visit the duchy. It happened right before the coming-of-age ceremony. Bertie felt like an ordinary abandoned child who was of no use to anyone, but even she had a right to something. She had to have a bright period in her life. And now she will try to do everything differently. She was given a second chance, and she will try to visit her father's house. And after the coming-of-age ceremony, she will definitely run away and become a merchant. She had gone too far in her dreams. Why did she have to become an ordinary trader? After all, she could create her own huge trade association. The whole world should know about it. Bertie had no doubt that she would succeed. It was not for nothing that fate had prepared so many trials for her. It meant that she deserved to be the best version of herself, because a second chance was only given to the chosen ones. All this was fine, of course, but at the moment the girl, transformed into Squirrel, stood near the doors of Aslan's northern castle and shivered from the cold. Fortunately, the guards noticed her. A spyglass was pointed at the girl, and from the guards' reaction she realized that they would come to her now. They must have noticed the signum, and that was very bad. She needed to run away from here quickly. But it was too late. Bertie heard someone calling her and calling her mistress. Then she was asked not to run away, and the phrase Princess Aslan was heard again. She had heard right. They called her a princess. One of the warriors ran up to her and bent down. The guy lifted his helmet and showed a surprised face. Why was she unaccompanied? After all, princesses are not allowed to move alone. This is completely unacceptable. Bertie started to explain something to the guard, but he smiled, apologized, and said he didn't understand squirrel language. And then it dawned on her that she was still in the body of a squirrel. The boy carefully picked her up, trying not to cause her pain or discomfort. He said he would take her inside the castle. The princess couldn't be freezing in front of the front door. He could get punished for that. The first people the girl met inside were the maids. They all opened their mouths in surprise and affection. Then they began to welcome the princess to the castle and say that she was ready to serve her at any moment and for any reason. But their joyful cries suddenly stopped because the maids saw Joanna. It was the head housekeeper. The woman seemed very serious and unapproachable. But the next moment, the head of the servants leaned over Bertie to get a better look at her. Joanna smiled with affection and said that the princess had lost a lot of weight, but she would see to it that everything returned to normal. Within a few minutes, the girl was seated at a table on which whole mountains of delicacies towered. The woman said that if the squirrel needed more, she would immediately organize everything, if only the princess would recover. Since Bertie had been on the road for a long time, she was quite hungry, and now delicious food was very welcome. She ate everything that was brought for her from the kitchen, and then washed it down with delicious drinks. But why did they treat her so well here? Once again, Ritter's image appeared before Bertie's eyes. She remembered that you can't trust anyone. Sometimes kindness brings terrible consequences. The prince had also been very kind to her, but in the end, he had killed her. If people show you too much kindness and attention, they definitely have ulterior motives, and they will definitely use them to harm you. Bertie learned this rule long ago. So the girl called Joanna over and said she needed to tell the head of staff something. She needed to test the waters and figure out what was really going on. The woman immediately approached Bertie, said that the girl could call her simply Joanna, and she was ready to fulfill any request. The woman thought that Bertie had a proposal for the gentleman. Not knowing what the girl would actually talk about, Joanna said that the gentleman was not home. He had gone to the battlefield again and had not said when he would return, but she could tell him everything by writing a note. But when their master finds out that the squirrel has finally returned home, he will definitely hurry to deal with all the enemies in order to quickly return home and see her. After all, her father loves her very much. In the meantime, the girl could rest and gain strength, but there was no time to rest. Bertie asked if there was a master in charge, who was performing his duties in the estate. She needed to prevent a military defeat. Before Joanna could answer the squirrel's question, the door suddenly opened and a young man appeared on the threshold. It was the master's deputy, Carlos Aslan. The man's expression was slightly nervous. But when he came closer and got a better look at the girl, Carlos smiled. He greeted her and said that they had been waiting for the escaped squirrel for a long time, and now, finally, she had returned. But what would happen next, the girl had no idea. The situation looked as if the squirrel had escaped on purpose. Everyone was looking for her, worried about her life and health, but finally she returned on her own. She probably created a lot of problems because of this. Joanna came running to stand up for the girl. The woman asked not to hurt the poor girl. Vita was still very young. Then she asked the Duke why he was covered in blood and began to tidy him up. Bertie had not yet been to the Duke's estate, but now she knew perfectly well who was standing before her. She had seen his portrait earlier. It was Carlos Aslan, the very man the whole country was talking about. He was an incredible guy. It seemed like he was born a warrior. He began to wield a sword flawlessly at the age of 10. There were and are no equals to him in this matter, and everyone says that the battlefield has long become his second home. His enemies never knew mercy. He has no equal in military affairs. Because of his hair, the color of dark blood, the inhabitants of the empire called him the King of Lions. The girl heard many stories about his exploits. Finally, it dawned on the girl that the guy standing in front of her, who was considered a hero of all times and nations, was her brother. Wow, she didn't expect to see him here. Carlos came even closer and sniffed. It was strange, the guy clearly identified the smell of snakes. But why was she emitting such a smell? After all, this is not typical of squirrels. So something happened to his sister. If only her brother had known what had happened to Bertie a few weeks ago, then everything would have been clear to him. She had been overcome by people she trusted completely. These people were vile, corrupt snakes, but she would have her revenge on them soon. It seemed that absolutely nothing could be hidden from this guy. He sees through people and distinguishes truth from lies at first sight. It was dangerous to look him in the eyes. That's how wonderful her brother is. For the first time in a long time, Bertie felt that she was in a safe place. And from such a terrible and strong Carlos, there was a warmth and peace. It was as if she was under a warm, weightless blanket. Usually everyone was afraid of the young Duke. His bright yellow eyes in the series instilled fear and panic in people. But Bertie looked at the guy with a smile and affection, and he was surprised in response. Could there really be a person who wasn't afraid of him? The next moment, Carlos leaned over and picked up the girl. He hugged her tightly and held her like that for several minutes. As it turned out, he then passed on his scent to her, the scent that the entire Aslan family should smell like. The thing is, no one had ever hugged Bertie, and it was at that moment that she got scared because she didn't know how to react to her brother's behavior. And why was he doing it? She thought at first that the guy hated her. Seeing that the girl was scared, the Duke put her down on the ground, and Joanna began to scold the guy for scaring the squirrel with his actions. She had just returned home. She needed to come to her senses. The woman reminded him that this girl was his sister, and he should take care of her, or at least treat her with respect, but the young man replied that it didn't matter. She was just a runaway squirrel. And the Duke was absolutely right. He reminded Joanna that this girl doesn't even have a name, but he's not going to hurt her. He's not interested in a woman's little children because he's a warrior. War calls him. The boy's words were pure and true. Indeed, the girl had no name until she was 10 years old. No one considered her a duke's daughter. She was a mudblood, and even the servants treated her with disdain. The maid did this because they followed the example of the Viscountess. Auntie always called Bertie an adopted half-breed. They were black, and the royal beastmen are famous for their golden eyes. Ritter had the eyes of a snake, their shade was yellowish. Carlos's were bright yellow, which indicated that the guy belonged to the lion family. The brighter the blood of the beast, the brighter the shade of gold in the eyes. The Aslan family has always been famous for the pure shade of gold in their eyes, but as it turns out, she also belongs to this glorious family. But why then are her eyes a completely different color? What is the reason? This should be found out. That was the reason why even the servants called her a mudblood. Her eyes were a different color. But now was not the time to talk about that. She would figure it out someday. And she had a name, so it wasn't all that bad. She remembers her name and will not allow anyone to call her a half-breed anymore, she shouted, which attracted the attention of Carlos and Joanna. The girl said in a firm voice that she had a name. Her name is Bertie. It seemed to her that after she had given her name, the young Duke froze for a second. It was impossible to tell how he had taken this information. Perhaps it was better for her not to mention it. Joanna smiled and said that the name was very beautiful and suited the girl. Then she asked if Bertie had come up with it herself, but she replied that her father had named her that, and it meant blessing. The young Duke thought for a moment, and then said that he would call his little sister Tail. But it was not an offensive name. After all, the distinctive feature of their family is their tails. The girl pouted her lips, feigning offense, and now she looked more like a small, angry chipmunk than a squirrel. But the guy just smiled. He didn't care how his sister would react to his words. Joanna decided to defuse the situation and intervene in the conversation, otherwise a scandal could occur. Carlos is a hot-tempered person, therefore the woman asked again if the girl wanted to see her father. The headmaid said that the master was not at his place at the moment, but she could meet with the manager who was in charge of all the affairs of the duchy. Perhaps they would have something to talk about. Joanna went off to find the manager, and then Bertie panicked. After all, the woman had left her alone with Carlos, and what was she supposed to talk about with this cocky guy? Even though he was her brother, he was behaving very strangely. Of course, the maids overheard the conversation in the room and were happy that the squirrel had already been given a name. But the housekeeper told them not to rejoice in vain. If you give a child an inappropriate name, its fate can change. For example, the character will not be suitable. This is so serious that the body may begin to deteriorate. The most harmless thing that can happen is that the child will be constantly haunted by misfortunes. According to Northern traditions, it often happens that parents give their child a name only a few years after its birth. Then at least some rudiments of personality appear, and it is possible to accurately choose a name. This is especially true for long-awaited children who are born in love and with the consent of both parents. Then choosing a name can take much more time. After all, a lot depends on what the child is named. Joanna said she hadn't even noticed that she hadn't started calling the girl by her name. She was still just a squirrel to her. She'd have to get used to calling little Miss Bertie, since that was her name. Meanwhile, Carlos was openly examining his runaway sister. She had beautiful hair, bright and fluffy, but she was not tall and was the size of his tail, a real tiny thing. He overheard the maids talking in the hallway. Everyone had seen Bertie as a squirrel. It turned out that he was the only one who hadn't seen her transformation, and he would have loved to see the process. The boy decided not to wait for the opportunity to present itself, so he decided to directly ask, or rather order the girl, to turn into a squirrel right now. He just had to see it. What kind of a proposal is this? Why should she demonstrate how she turns into a squirrel in front of her brother? And why is he even asking her to do this? What kind of mockery is this of a little sister? Strangely, the young Duke saw that the girl was starting to worry. It seemed to him that he hadn't asked for anything bad, but on the other hand, his little sister didn't refuse and didn't even try to run away. From early childhood, the aura of a predator awoke in Carlos's body. That's why all the small animals instinctively ran away from him, trying to save their lives. Over the years, this aura only grew stronger, but for some reason, it didn't work on this little brat. She, in turn, looked at her brother with wide eyes and tried to calm down. In her past life, only her father ignored her. Her brother had done nothing bad to her, so there was no point in being afraid of him. Unlike her, he is a strong and brave beast. Brother is the pride of the family and the public's favorite, and he deserved all this not because of the title and father, but only because of his intelligence and endurance. Friendship with such a person will definitely not hurt her. On the contrary, her brother will become a reliable protection for her. Therefore, without thinking twice, Birdie turned into a small, soft, and fluffy animal. The young Duke was surprised, and then he smiled. He was touched by this little animal, and he tried to find something in common between the lion and the squirrel. Carlos decided that their ears were similar. The squirrel looked at him and tried to understand the emotions the young Duke was experiencing at that moment. He was very wrong about the ears. The lion and the squirrel have completely different ones, but if it is convenient for him to think so, then let them be similar. Carlos watched the squirrel for a while longer, and then ordered his guard to bring him some seeds. She was so skinny, let her eat. Then he took one seed in his palm and handed it to Birdie. How pleased she was that her brother decided to take care of her. The baby quickly jumped onto the guy's palms and began to eat her favorite treat. The chance that they would become friends increased with each passing minute, and the young Duke couldn't take his eyes off the cute little animal. How funny she was. Why did the squirrel wander around the world for so long? I wonder where she's been and what her life was like before today. Carlos caught himself thinking that a strange and unknown feeling had appeared in his soul, as if an invisible warmth was enveloping his entire body, and he wanted to smile constantly. Was it the squirrel doing this to him? But his thoughts were interrupted by Joanna. The woman said that the master was calling them. But how? He wasn't in the castle. How did he manage to return so quickly? She wasn't ready for such an important meeting yet. She needed to gather her thoughts. And then a terrible thought came into Birdie's head. Her father probably wanted to see her so he could throw her out of the palace right now. He had never shown love to his daughter. Moreover, he had not even sought to meet her for many years. The maid looked at the Duke and the squirrel carefully. She said that she was very glad that the brother and sister had managed to become friends in such a short time, and that was the truth. Then Joanna was silent for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She didn't know how to delicately ask the squirrel to turn back into a cute little girl. She couldn't appear before her father as an animal. When the maid took the girl to her room to change into her best clothes, the Duke began to question his guard about how the squirrel got into the castle. He answered that he found her at the central gate. She was frozen and wanted to get inside. For some reason, the little girl never left the boy's mind for a minute. Her fur was so soft and fluffy. And when she turned into a girl, she became even cuter, and most importantly, she is not afraid of him at all. Carlos certainly liked the role of the older brother. He had never held small animals in his arms before. They ran away from him, saving their lives. But this squirrel feels his energy and is not afraid at all. Half an hour later, Joanna and the baby returned to the young Duke. Together, they walked to the doors, behind which was the master's study. The atmosphere was quite tense. Birdie did not know what awaited her. But everything happened differently than the girl imagined. Her father was not in the office. Instead, a pleasant young man stood at the table and smiled at the guests. Joanna forgot to say that they were going to the manager, not the master. It was a pleasant-looking guy. His name was Count Gelot, and he was the right hand of Mr. Aslan. The manager rose from the table and bowed to the girl. He was also glad to meet her. The girl smiled and also introduced herself, saying that her name was Birdie and that her father had given her the name. But she was told that her father wanted to see her, but it turned out that this was not true at all. But she did not mind talking to the manager for a while. The man thought for a moment, then replied that the gentleman had asked to notify him immediately after the girl appeared in the palace. For this, the manager would use a magic crystal ball. It turned out that with the help of this magic ball, which was a kind of communicator, you can communicate in real time. The Duke is now at war, but he will have no problem talking to his daughter even at a distance. There are, of course, some nuances. For example, if there is a fierce battle going on now, then it will be extremely difficult for her father to get in touch. The North is currently in the midst of a fierce war with an enemy nation. The girl wanted to shout loudly that she was here precisely because she wanted to prevent this damned, drawn-out bloodshed, but she did not dare because she did not know how those present would react. The manager tried to connect Bertie to her father with a ball, but nothing happened. The man apologized and suggested that the gentleman was now in the middle of military action. The Duke was so busy that he simply sent his daughter to the capital and forgot about her for many years. He probably didn't expect that the girl would decide to return to her home, where she was not welcome at all. He might even get angry. Carles kept his eyes on the girl. She looked so sad and broken that the boy wanted to take her in his arms, hug her tightly and calm her down. There were tears in Bertie's eyes, but she tried to hold them back. Bertie remembered her aunt, the Viscountess, who did nothing but reproach and scold the girl for any reason. She did not even hide the fact that she hated her niece, but she was little and could not change anything. With a smile on his face, the duchy's manager told Bertie that she would have to wait a little while. When the war was over, she would definitely see and talk to her father. But then Carles intervened in their conversation, and his expression showed that the guy was very angry. He approached the man and reminded him that he was only following orders, but that he should not interfere in family matters. The manager was a little confused, and a minute later he froze in a bow. He apologized for interfering in something that was none of his business, and for possibly insulting the girl. But then some strange sounds were heard from the ball. Count Gillot apologized again and went to the communication device. It was clear that someone was giving instructions to the man on the other end of the line, and the manager promised to do everything right away. Then Gillot turned to the girl and said that His Majesty had contacted and wanted to speak to Bertie. Using the ball was not difficult at all. You just had to go up to it and put your hands on it. The girl immediately followed all the man's instructions and waited impatiently for the moment when she could hear her father's voice, and then it came from nowhere, right overhead. The Duke asked why she had returned to the north. She had never heard her father's voice, but now she knew for sure that it was he who was talking to her, the man who had an entire army, thousands of people under his command. He asked again what had happened in the capital. Why had she run away? Well, what could she answer to such a question? What should she do? She couldn't tell him that she died at the hands of the prince, or rather from his teeth. How could she tell him that it was because of him that she turned into a squirrel and ran away from the castle? From her point of view, she has uncovered a terrible traitor and saved her own life. But to everyone else in the family, she is a disgrace to the entire Aslan family, and she will not be able to explain everything in a way that will be believed. Leonhardt, the head of the Aslan clan, asked her not to hide anything and to tell the whole truth. And then Bertie thought, what if her father knows the whole truth, and now he is simply testing her for honesty? So it is not worth lying. And the girl told her father how her aunt had been torturing her all this time, and then tried to marry her off to the first Prince Ritter. She arranged a meeting between the prince and Bertie, a sort of viewing. At first, the prince and the girl became friends and got along well. He even promised to protect her in any circumstances. But then something went wrong. He started to act together with the aunt behind her back. Bertie decided not to tell the whole truth. They wouldn't believe her anyway, so she simply said that she was afraid that she would actually be married off even without her father's consent, and ran north to ask the Duke for protection. Leonhardt, to the girl's surprise, supported her. He said that he would not allow her to marry the prince without his will. The man was very angry with his sister, who acted without informing him. But it got worse. Duke Aslan said that while he was at war, there would be no chance to see her. He could not leave the battlefield, and Bertie should return to the capital and not be afraid of anything. He would not let anyone harm her. The girl learned that heavy fighting was taking place behind the high mountains of the north. Therefore, the supply of food and weapons there was very difficult. The army was holding on with its last strength and constantly asking for reinforcements. She listened attentively and then decided to admit that she had come here to help her father win the war as quickly as possible with the least losses. But no one listened to her. What could a child understand about war? Carlise watched as the squirrel tail, which was sticking out from under the hem of her dress, twitched nervously. He understood that the girl was worried, and for some reason this worry was transmitted to him. He had to intervene to help the little one. And he couldn't stand it. He came up and also put his hand on the ball. Then he asked his father in a calm tone what he had told Balachka. He answered that he wanted her to calmly return to the capital and not to return until he gave the order. The boy knew perfectly well that it was not safe for his sister to stay in the north, but first he had to ask Squirrel if she wanted to live in Duke Leonhard Aslan's palace, and she replied that she would be happy to stay. The Duke heard the conversation between the brother and sister, and he was unhappy with what he heard, but his son calmed him down. He would definitely be able to protect his little sister from enemies. Besides, there were a lot of guards in the palace. But Leonhard wasn't so sure. He assumed that their castle might be on the front line. How could they protect their people, and especially Squirrel Paw? There's nothing more dangerous than blind confidence. The Duke's voice was confident and his order could not be discussed. He decided that his daughter should be in a safe place, and that was precisely the capital. The enemy army would definitely not be able to reach there. But the brother and sister decided to try their luck anyway. Carlise tried to convince his father. For some reason, he really wanted this brave little girl to stay in her home. She was very sweet. The boy was a warrior, and in war, all means are fair. So Carlise decided to lie. He told her father that the girl had lost all her weight, that she was in bad shape. He was not sure that she would be able to reach the capital at all. Leonhard seemed to be thinking a little. Yes, he really hadn't seen his daughter for many years and had no idea what his little girl looked like now. But Carlise was with her now, and he knew better what was happening to Bertie. Maybe the young Duke is right. The girl really has come a long way. Probably such a journey has exhausted her. Besides, she will be all alone in the capital. He will not give her back to the Viscountess. There was an awkward pause, after which the girl finally heard from her father that he allowed her to stay. She would live in her parents' palace until Leonhard returned home from the war. Now she should thank her brother from the bottom of her heart. If it weren't for his pitiful speeches, the Duke would definitely send her back to the capital. And there the hated Ritter awaits her. But Carlise didn't want to listen to anything. As a token of gratitude, he asked the girl to let him touch her fluffy red tail. It was so cute. Bertie was surprised. She had never thought of such a strange request. Finally, the boy managed to touch his sister's fluffy tail. It was so soft and gentle that the Duke did not want to take his hand away. The guard did not lie. The squirrel's fur is truly magnificent. Bertie couldn't say that her brother's actions brought her great pleasure. She was afraid that the boy, like all boys, would start pulling her favorite ponytail. It would be better if he asked to touch her pigtails. Suddenly, Joanna came running into the room screaming. The woman reported that a fire had broken out in the palace. The warehouse in the left wing had caught fire, and most of the building was also on fire. Panic was all around. The young Duke reacted instantly. He knew very well that most of the army's spare ammunition was there, and if the fire got there, the army would certainly be left without weapons. What would he tell his father? When the guy finally ran to the fire site, he saw a continuous fire that was devouring more and more territory. He didn't lose his head and immediately began to command. A lot of water was needed. Carlise himself did not understand how he managed to organize the water supply to the fire site so quickly. Probably his military bearing and stress resistance worked. All the inhabitants of the castle came running to help. Only one squirrel stood aside and couldn't even move. She understood that this was the first news about the retreat. Events are repeating themselves. Everything is happening the same as in the past life. The girl knew that after this terrible incident, rather than losing most of the weapons and food for the army, the troops would have to retreat, and the Duke would not be able to end this war. She had already seen all these events in her past life. Many people did not understand the reason for the army's first retreat. Duke Leonhard became a laughingstock. From the golden lion, he turned into a wet kitten. The girl also knew that her father did not reveal the details of those events. He did not want to discredit the royal honor. The first reason was a fire, then the lack of food for the soldiers. and next year a huge catastrophe was supposed to happen. The army of the Kingdom of Aslan would lose a huge number of soldiers in this catastrophe. It would be almost half of its strength, and the Duchy of Aslan would suffer huge losses. Bertie understood that she had to prevent all this at all costs. To prevent all subsequent disasters, it would be logical to stop the very first disaster. That's what the girl thought, and decided that she would not allow Aslan's army to retreat at any cost. It was within her power. She just had to try. Carlos disappeared somewhere, and an hour later the girl learned that he had turned into a lion and went in search of the one who had set fire to the building with provisions for the army. 2 hours later, the criminal was already caught and brought to the palace. It is worth noting that this was the first time Bertie had seen her brother in such a form, and what she saw pleased her more and more. In this form, Carlos was even more menacing and self-assured. But I didn't have to watch the lion guy for long. After a few minutes, he turned into a handsome young man with a wonderful torso again. He must have forgotten to put on a shirt on purpose. As it turned out, the criminal was already dead. The guards asked if the gentleman had killed this traitor, but Carlos calmly replied that the man had committed suicide. He was probably afraid of punishment for what he had done. The young duke came closer to the lying corpse and looked closely at his hand. On the outside of the palm was a sign. The guy looked more closely. It was an image of the mark of the Holy Empire. But something didn't add up in the guy's conclusions. The criminal couldn't be walking around the warehouses he set on fire, even without any particular intention of hiding. And his mark was in a very visible place. It was some kind of trap or deception. The Duke thought about it. He was not used to taking everyone's word for it. He needed to check everything thoroughly. It couldn't be that easy and obvious. Someone was trying to pull the wool over his eyes. But Carlos was no weakling. The man who was responsible for provisions for Aslan's army approached the boy. He was at a loss. Tomorrow they were supposed to send carts with food and weapons to the battlefield. But what to do now? There was nothing to send. Count Jello appeared out of nowhere. He was a little sad and said that he was to blame for not being able to foresee the fire. Duke Leonhardt had appointed him as a manager, and he had failed to justify his master's trust. But Carlos reassured him. There were no culprits here. No one could have foreseen such a turn of events. The arson was planned by one of the enemies. But still, there must be a traitor in their house who helped the criminal. But the manager was completely upset. He asked for forgiveness again. He should have kept a better eye on the situation in the palace. Now, because of him, the army would be left without provisions, and this would lead to defeat in the battle. Carlos could not get rid of the habit of suspecting everyone and everything. It seemed strange to him that the manager had come running to them on the street, and even stranger was the fact that for some reason he wanted to put the blame on himself. Bertie stood and watched for a long time, but finally she decided to intervene. She asked to be heard because she had something to say. But Carlos smiled and called her tale. And why, looking at the naked torso of the young duke, she could not clearly express her thoughts. It was very annoying. And it was also annoying that this impudent guy allowed himself to call her tale in front of strangers. The next second, the girl decided that now was not the time for resentment. The situation needed to be saved, and in particular, Duke Aslan's army. So she handed the men a handful of large red berries. Carlos took one of the berries from her, but everyone knew that this plant was very poisonous. It was called the scarecrow, and it came straight from hell. The berries had paralytic properties, so no one even touched it. The Duke tried to take the berries from the girl carefully, but she wouldn't let him. Bertie said that she had already thought of everything, and these berries could really help them. Why wouldn't they listen to her for a minute? Count Gelot froze in a bow again and allowed himself to remind the girl that now was not the time for such entertainment. These were ordinary poisonous berries. They could not feed the Duke's entire army. Finally, Carlos couldn't stand it any longer and ordered everyone to be quiet. And the girl said that the plant can grow in any conditions. Both the leaves and the fruits are edible, and one such berry can feed 2 warriors. The manager tried to be calm, but it was very bad. He tried to explain to this little girl again that the plant was completely poisonous and would cause a lot of trouble to the soldiers' health. If the warriors eat even a little of these berries, their stomachs will simply burn from the poison, and then the enemy army will easily capture the positions of Aslan's army. How will these berries help? They will only harm. Everyone started whispering. What was this little girl up to? She wanted to destroy her father's army and then endanger the whole country. After all, everyone knew that tuberosum caused diarrhea and cramps. The girl was tired of listening to this nonsense for the 100th time, so she asked everyone to pay attention to her. The next minute, she opened her mouth, bit off a huge piece of berry, and swallowed it. Everyone gaped in horror and surprise. This girl was definitely crazy. They already had more than enough problems, and now she was here with her inventions. Now they would have to call the doctors and urgently wash out her stomach. The doctor came immediately on the young master's orders. How stupid his little sister was, stupid and stubborn. But the doctor, having examined the girl, said that she was absolutely healthy and there were no signs of poisoning. The Duke was furious. Well, that can't be, because tuberosum berries are very dangerous. Why doesn't Tail get an upset stomach? Maybe this doctor is bad and doesn't understand diseases. The plant is definitely poisonous, but why doesn't the poison affect Squirrel? Maybe these little animals have different digestion, and what is dangerous for people is completely normal for squirrels. He couldn't find any other explanation. Or maybe there are varieties of these berries, and some of them can be eaten, while the girl learned to distinguish between poisonous and non-poisonous types of tuberosum, and he considered her stupid an hour ago. Another guard suggested that the girl might have some magical powers. Maybe she was a witch. After all of Aslan's clan could turn into lions, and she could turn into a squirrel. The girl decided not to delay with the answer and explained to the men the reason why she was not poisoned. It turned out that it was all about the stems. Their juice contains an antidote that neutralizes the poison from the berries. So that's the reason. Until now, everyone thought that the plant was completely poisonous, but they ate only the fruits. But if you eat the berries together with the stems, poisoning will not occur. Before coming here, the girl chewed several stems. The liquid worked, so after she swallowed the berry itself, nothing special or terrible happened. She was not poisoned. Birdie knew that the fact about the tuberosum berry stems would not be discovered for several years. One of the criminals in the future would simply eat the plant whole and not die of severe indigestion. Since the guards were afraid to test the plant's effects on themselves, the young master had to do it. So Carlise took one of the plants and ate the berry along with the stem. Everyone froze in anticipation. Enough time passed, but nothing happened to the young master. He still felt great. And only then did the guards decide to try the berries as well. Everyone was happy. The guards not only satisfied their curiosity, but also ate well. And all thanks to the little squirrel, she solved a big problem. Now the army will not feel hungry. Birdie knew that in this way she could prevent the first retreat of Aslan's army. With luck, the war would not drag on for another 10 long years. She must take advantage of this fact. Everyone praised the girl, complimented her. So small, but already so smart. But only the manager stood aside in a bad mood. The problem was solved, and how could he report it now? Meanwhile, the soldiers were already suffering from a shortage of provisions. Famine was about to begin. What kind of battle could we talk about if everyone was only thinking about food? But then the assistant commander reported that he saw a cart with provisions. Leonhardt left his tent to assess how much food and weapons the city of Carlis had sent, but a guard was already waiting for him, handing the man a letter. It was written to her father by Squirrel. In the letter, the girl asked how he was doing, whether he was healthy, whether his soldiers were healthy. Then she told him that she was doing well and that she had very good news for him, which would significantly influence the course of the war. Meanwhile, the warriors began to unload the provisions. It turned out that the boxes contained poisonous berries. But why did they send so many of them? Maybe they mixed up the carts, or there was some mistake. But the accompanying letter clearly stated that Birdie was giving the soldiers tuberosum plants. It was strange that the Duke's daughter was writing to them. This girl was only 8 years old. She might not understand all the implications. This was not the food the soldiers were expecting. Everyone was very hungry, but no one dared to eat the poisonous berries and die of terrible diarrhea the next day. What was this girl doing, and did the Duke know about it? Leonhardt came out into the yard. He saw that his soldiers were standing in confusion and looking at the berries. Well, his own daughter can't wish him dead, so the man took one berry with the stem and ate it. Thus, Leonhardt showed that tuberosum berries were quite suitable for consumption. The warriors, without thinking twice, followed their commander's example and reached for the fruits. They were too hungry. The soldiers were able to satisfy their hunger. Now they can follow their commander into battle. How wise and brave he is. They are ready to follow Leonhardt into fire and water because they love their master and trust him. But the Duke of the North knew perfectly well that the soldiers should be grateful not to him, but to a little girl named Birdie, his daughter. It was she who prevented a great disaster and saved them from starvation. His squirrel learned to write so beautifully and to express her thoughts logically. She was smart beyond her years. And that's good. Someone has to have brains. Most warriors only have muscles. Did Duke Aslan feel remorse for not paying attention to his daughter for so long? Yes, he did. But he couldn't do otherwise. He had to rule the north and guard the borders of the empire. But we need to go back a few days, to the very day when the young princess wrote a letter to her father. She didn't even know if the Duke would read her message, but she couldn't pass up the chance. She checked the text of the letter again. She couldn't let her father think she was illiterate, but everything was fine. If only Duke Leonhardt could read a message from her, she would be so happy. Just in case, she gave the text to Joanna to read again. The woman was surprised that the girl's handwriting was very adult, and she wrote very correctly. If the woman hadn't known better, she would have thought that the girl had graduated from the academy. The housekeeper also said that the young duke had formed a volunteer squad, and they had already set out to collect tuberosum plants for Leonhardt's army. The provisions would be sent in a day. Birdie was overjoyed that she had finally managed to help her father and his army. But it was not enough. There was still a lot of work ahead. Everything was just beginning. Now she wanted to go and help the volunteers. But then the girl heard her brother's calm and composed voice behind her. He asked where this little one was going. Tail was too small to help collect the tuberosum plants. The guy reminded her that it was high time for her to go to bed, and she was too weak after the journey north, and he promised her father that he would take care of her, so she would not go anywhere, but would eat well and go to bed. Joanna supported the young duke. The girl really needed to rest. Besides, the maids had already prepared her room. The girl was surprised that she would even have a separate room. Her father didn't like her at all, rather hated her. So why did he make sure she had a separate room? Or maybe it wasn't Duke Leonhardt at all, but someone else who was worried about her comfortable stay here. It was also strange that Carlos himself volunteered to take the girl to her new room, although Joanna could have easily done it. Oh well, I'll have to endure the strange jokes at my expense. The woman was very happy that the brother and sister were able to become friends. Few people can communicate normally with this guy, and all because of his charisma and difficult character. But the little fluffy squirrel melted his heart. It's strange. Carlos seemed very powerful and unapproachable, but for Squirrel, he even held the big heavy door so that she wouldn't hit it. And how can we understand this? Why does he behave like this with her? She wouldn't have opened such a door on her own. She had too little strength and her legs were very short. The girl almost burst into tears on the spot. The guy even felt a little sorry for her, so small and weak. Probably, you can't compare her to yourself. He is a big and strong lion. She is a fragile little squirrel with a fluffy, insanely beautiful tail. Carlos never thought that he would have to take care of a baby. Finally, they entered the room. But compared to the girl's size, it seemed to her that this was not a room, but a whole huge apartment. Here you can simply get lost among all this beauty. It turned out that her room had a separate dressing room, a toy room, a small study room, a huge balcony. Then they came to another huge door. Behind it was her bedroom. The girl thought that she was probably being tested for greed, but she didn't need any of that. Pathos and wealth had never attracted her, so Birdie felt a little uneasy. Why was she getting so much attention? She explained to her brother that she didn't need all that. A simple room, like a servant's room, would be enough. She could live there quietly and not cause any problems for anyone. Birdie didn't come here for wealth. She needed a father. The guy called his sister over and pointed to the end of the corridor. That was where her room ended, and the girl thought that they had almost allocated an entire floor for her. What a trick. The young duke took pity on the girl, bent down and picked her up. She was already tired of running around the house with him, let her rest a little, but it seemed that the little sister did not like it. She was a little scared. But Birdie wasn't really scared. She was just shy. She felt awkward being treated with such warmth and care, and she started saying that she was heavy and that her brother would get tired. It seemed that Carlos did not even listen to her words. He continued to carry the girl in his arms around her apartment. Finally, he said that the little girl had worked very hard today, so she should have a good rest, and carried her to the bedroom. For some reason, the girl remembered her previous room. It served her as a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room. The only furniture there was a table, a chest of drawers, a chair, and a narrow bed. And now the bed alone was bigger than her entire former home. But the most beautiful thing about this bedroom was the balcony. It had a stunning view of a small, beautiful lake surrounded by bushes and trees. This would probably be her favorite place to relax. If she hadn't gathered her courage and escaped from the capital, she probably wouldn't have seen such beauty. In the big city, even in the Imperial Palace garden, there was no landscape more beautiful than this. She thought that if she tried really hard, she could stay in this house until she came of age. She could admire these views, enjoy the cool weather, and be closer to her father. Carlos carefully put the girl to bed, not forgetting to call her a tailed cutie and make her angry. Then the guy wished her good night and said to contact him if anything happened. But how can you go to bed if the sun hasn't even set yet? Or maybe Northerners are used to going to bed early. But the guy replied that she was tired during the day and needed to gain strength. The Duke seemed to enjoy teasing the little thing, so he wondered out loud that it would have been extremely difficult for little Squirrel to get north on such short legs. She wanted to be angry with Carlos, but for some reason she couldn't. He was too kind to her. No one had ever treated her with such reverence. So she simply pouted and replied that she had come here by carriage. When will he get tired of mocking her? She didn't do anything bad. She just went back to her parents' house, closer to her father. Maybe he's jealous of her dad. You can't just be so mean for no reason. Suddenly, Joanna appeared at the door of the bedroom. She apologized for interrupting the conversation between her brother and sister, but the maids had arrived and were waiting for the time when they could prepare the little mistress for bed. What the woman saw surprised her very much. The young gentleman was playing with a squirrel, and a sweet smile played on his face. She had never seen him so calm and peaceful. Carlos seemed happy, but the same could not be said about the squirrel. She looked confused and slightly angry. Why should she turn into a fluffy animal at the first command of this crazy Carlos? She is not a toy. And he wanted to play with her, just be together, and make sure that this little squirrel liked everything. Carlos brought a mountain of toys, sweets, and outfits. His eyes were shining with joy. Joanna was also happy and asked Squirrel if she liked playing with the young gentleman. After all, he was so happy that he could spend time with her. She changed Carlos, made him more joyful. I wanted to burst from anger and resentment because no one understood the squirrel language. She just wants to explain that she doesn't like all these games and entertainment. She just wants a normal attitude towards herself. The girl was helped into her pajamas and ready for bed. Judging by the nightwear, it cost a fortune. She didn't understand why she had to sleep in such expensive things, so the Aslan Duchy was much richer than she thought. Before going to bed, Birdie wanted to drink some water and left the bedroom in search of a cup and a decanter. But, as it turned out, the young gentleman was still there. Why didn't he leave? What was he waiting for? She asked her brother if he wanted to sleep. He looked the girl over from head to toe and said that he decided to stay here until Squirrel fell asleep, so that no one would disturb her sleep, and he asked her not to communicate in such an official tone. He was her brother. Carlos found water and gave the baby a drink. Then he picked her up again and carried her to bed. She became shy again. Why did he take such care of her? After all, she could easily climb into bed herself. He wished the girl good night again and offered to tell her a bedtime story. But Squirrel pouted and refused for some reason. Then the guy decided to just sit by her bed until she fell asleep. What's going on? At first he seemed so menacing and unapproachable. He was cheeky and called her names. But now, for the first time, he called her by her name and not by her little tail. And how should she feel about him now? While Squirrel was lounging in bed in the other wing of the palace, Count Jello was furious with anger. And how could this little scruffy squirrel, unknown to anyone until then, prevent him from carrying out his plan? He had been preparing everything for so long, planning every step, considering all the nuances. And then the trouble came. This nasty little thing appeared, poking its squirrel nose where it shouldn't. Now he had to explain everything to the customers. The magic ball was giving a sign that they wanted to contact him. Why now? What would he tell the lady? How would he explain that their plan had failed? But there was nothing to be done. He would have to get in touch and come up with something. The second queen of Astrum was not in the mood. She was not used to waiting for long, and this crazy manager Jello allowed himself not to get in touch. What do you mean? What does this fool allow himself? How dare this traitor not get in touch at the appointed time? She was expecting good news from him, but somehow she suspected that Jello didn't have any. He was just a vile coward. She called the Viscountess to her. After all, it was she who had allowed the girl to run away to the north to her father. Now let her solve these terrible problems. Viscountess Sirius must not repeat her mistake. And Mrs. Sirius understood perfectly well that the queen joked extremely rarely. The situation was extremely difficult now. We had to try to fix everything, otherwise Her Majesty would order to deal with her in a matter of minutes. Bertie's morning began with the beautiful singing of birds outside her bedroom window. Never before had she noticed how beautifully the sparrows chirped, how beautiful the sunrise was. This was the real magic of nature. After some time, the maid knocked on the door. The girl asked how Balochka slept in her new place and if everything was okay with her. And then she offered to choose a dress that she would wear today. As far as the girl remembered, she had only one dress, the one she had gotten to the northern castle in. But after a few minutes, she realized that she now had a whole wardrobe with dozens of beautiful dresses. When Bertie came out of the dressing room, the maids were simply delighted with the beauty of this girl. She was so sweet that everyone wanted to touch her, hug her, and cuddle her. After all, there were never any children in the castle. Millions of compliments started pouring in on the girl, and she stood there and didn't understand what criteria they were using to evaluate her appearance. She was an ordinary girl who could simply transform into Squirrel. In the capital, completely different things were considered beautiful and nice. For example, people considered gold coins beautiful and delightful, but they hid them away from prying eyes. Jewelry was beautiful, but not people. It is very difficult for her to get used to this attitude. Before, her aunt had never called her beautiful or even sweet, but here everyone admires her. There are completely different values here, or they consider her a beautiful thing. So Bertie decided to dot the I's and cross the T's. She explained to the maids that she was not a toy, she was not a thing and belonged only to herself. But the girls did not understand what she was talking about and continued to be touched. Finally, the whole ordeal of choosing a dress and changing clothes was over, and the maid said that they could go down for breakfast. Bertie breathed a sigh of relief. She would be able to get rid of these annoying maids. In the living room, another maid came up to her and thanked Bertie. It turned out that her beloved was fighting with Duke Aslan, and the girl saved him from starvation with her actions. And again, the girl was deeply surprised. An hour ago, she had been told a bunch of compliments about her beauty, and now she was being thanked for her intelligence. It turns out that she is not only beautiful, but also smart. Perhaps she needs to get used to it. The estate of the Duke of the North was strikingly different from life in the capital. Here, people were cheerful and friendly. The palace shone with cleanliness, beauty, and luxury. It seemed that she had found herself in a fairy tale and did not want to go back. Carlos was already waiting for her at the table in the living room. He was smiling and in a good mood. But why did he come? To have breakfast? Or to see his little sister? The guy cheered up at the sight of Squirrel, asked how she slept. Auntie used to say that Bertie's presence at the table spoiled everyone's appetite. She was used to eating alone, so now she felt uneasy about eating in front of other people. Bertie got up from the table and headed for the exit. She apologized and said that she would wait in the room until the young Duke had breakfasted. She would not disturb him and spoil his appetite with her appearance. But the Duke's face instantly became sad and slightly surprised. He was upset. He asked why she didn't want to have breakfast with him. Did she dislike his company? He would leave himself then so as not to spoil Squirrel's mood. Birdie stopped short. What was he saying? After a moment's silence, she asked if she would disturb the Duke at breakfast. Perhaps he would not like to sit at the same table with her. But the boy smiled and said that he had been waiting all night for the morning to come so that he could see his little sister at breakfast. Could she possibly think that he was uncomfortable in his company? Birdie, without thinking twice, climbed onto a chair and began to eat. Everything was incredibly delicious. Carlos sat quietly opposite her and watched her with affection. She should eat well. She still has a lot of growing to do. Breakfast went well. It turned out that eating in the presence of good people is much more pleasant than in complete solitude. But everyone treats her well only because they do not know that her father hates her. Duke Leonhardt has not been in the palace for 5 years. He spent all his time at war. Therefore, no one here knows that he hates his daughter, considering her a burden to the family. He is simply embarrassed by his child. When he returned from the war, everything would fall into place, and the people at the palace would understand that Birdie must be treated in a completely different way. She must be despised and avoided. After all, the Duke had no use for her at all. She needed to calm down a bit and stop believing in stupid fairy tales with happy endings. Someday, Carlos's attitude towards her would change too. But she knew from the very beginning that this was exactly how it would be. But until that happens, she can be kind to all these people who surround her now. Even if it ends, she will remember these good times with gratitude. She should be kinder to the young Duke. After all, he treats her very well. Maybe he doesn't mean to call her Tail and Little Fluffy. After all, she really is very small compared to the huge lion. The girl immediately ran into the garden and gathered a lot of different berries and nuts. This way she would be able to thank all the servants, and she would take most of them to Duke Carlos. Let him enjoy the delicacies as well. It turned out that giving small, cute gifts to people is very pleasant. Everyone, including the guards at the main gate, were pleasantly surprised by the nuts and thanked the little lady a lot. In the capital, her aunt often scolded her and then deprived her of food as punishment. The girl remained hungry, but then she found a way for herself. She turned into a squirrel, ran away from the room, and went into the forest in search of tasty nuts. One day, while walking in the forest, Birdie saw a very beautiful tree. She went up to it and touched the trunk. She felt a strange vibration. This had never happened before. Higher powers were giving some kind of sign. It was her mark on her wrist that began to vibrate. Singham was warning her. But about what? She was being lured somewhere by a supernatural force that she could not resist. She was confused and did not know what to do. A maid ran up to Birdie and asked the girl to go home. She also heard strange sounds in the forest and felt uneasy. It was necessary to save the little mistress. After all, she would not be able to protect herself. But they didn't have time to escape. A whistle was heard and a small animal fell on Birdie's head. It was a unique white squirrel. The guards immediately ran up. Everyone was scared, and the girl froze in place, rooted to the spot. Birdie was afraid to move, because she didn't know how the little animal on her head would behave, but it leaned against her ear and whispered that it had finally found her. And that was more than strange. Why was it looking for her? A snowstorm swirled around, and a whirlwind swept through the yard. Everything happened in 1 second. The snowstorm was so bad that absolutely nothing could be seen. When the guards came to their senses, they did not find the little lady. She was gone. The guards were scared out of their wits. The young master would skin them alive for not keeping an eye on the little girl. The maid started crying. She had been accompanying Squirrel, and now she was missing. There was a real panic in the palace. The demonic beast had kidnapped the little lady. He had attacked her from above. He had appeared out of nowhere and had kidnapped the harmless little girl. And yet she had come to her father without ever seeing him. While everyone in the castle was looking for Squirrel, Carlos was wandering through the nearby northern mountains. He wanted to find the fox's lair, but instead he came across magical creatures that were wandering around in search of profit. His sister treated him to nuts so kindly that he decided to give her a return gift, a fox fur coat. He thought that the girl would look very cute in such clothes. At home, he was scolded by Joanna and his personal assistant for hunting animals, and then coming to the palace with blood on his clothes and hands. His little sister might get scared from that sight. Squirrel is still too young to understand such things, so everyone in the castle must be careful with her. She might get very scared and simply run away. And what will they tell Duke Leonhardt then? The boy understood everything. He would not scare the little one anymore, so he would catch a rare blue fox without getting his clothes bloody. He decided that Squirrel would wear a fur coat made of this animal's fur. I wonder what Squirrel will say about this catch. He managed to catch the fox after all, and now his sweet little sister will have a great outfit. It's cold in the north, and she's so tiny she needs warm clothes. As he approached the house, the boy saw that something had happened there. Everyone was bustling about, running back and forth, and constantly talking about the forest. But from afar he couldn't hear the conversation in full. The guards saw him and fell silent. Carlos's heart began to pound wildly as he approached, and saw the frightened faces of the servants and guards. But he did not see his tailed cutie, Birdie. Where was she? Resting in her room? But the guards stuttered and said that the little lady had been kidnapped by an unknown magical beast. It appeared from the air, and no one even had time to realize how a huge whirlwind had flown in and carried Squirrel away in an unknown direction. The warriors whispered that it was definitely a snowstorm squirrel. It is cunning and very dangerous. Recently, in the mountains, it killed traders who were heading south of the country, but where it lives and why it stole Birdie, no one knew. And how could this happen? He hadn't kept an eye on the little-tailed brat, and now he had to find her at all costs. She was definitely in danger, and he had to hurry. He couldn't leave the palace unattended. He even felt uneasy when he imagined that this little one was now in the clutches of some bloodthirsty beast. Or maybe she was kidnapped for ransom, and now she was sitting in a dark and cold dungeon. He wouldn't be Carlos of Aslan's line if he let some monster take his furry little sister. The Duke barked for every guard the castle had. They were going to find Squirrel Paw. When the squirrel came to, she did not immediately understand where she was. There was a winter forest all around. She was cold and very scared. All she remembers is the whisper of a small white squirrel on her shoulder. Looking around and calming down a bit, Birdie finally realized that she was on the North Mountain. But how could she have ended up here? Who had dragged her here? Suddenly she heard a voice. Someone quietly greeted her and said that she had finally reached the right place. Turning around, the girl saw a small white squirrel in the snow. It was the one talking to her. The little animal called Birdie a fragment. Then he explained that she was a fragment of a star. No matter how hard Birdie tried, she still couldn't understand anything. What star? What fragment? What was this weird squirrel talking about? And she said that the girl was part of it. The white fluffy one began to explain differently, so that it would be clearer. The squirrel said that he is a constellation, the ruler of all the stars. To be more precise, there is a constellation of a squirrel in the sky. The girl had heard something about constellations before, and that the predecessors of the beastmen lived on them. But she couldn't even imagine that such a thing existed in reality, and now she sees her ancestor. Just in case, Birdie asked the squirrel if her train of thought was correct. And he nodded in agreement. It was thanks to him that she was here. But it was not for long. The constellation just wanted to talk to her. And then there was silence. The girl finally understood. When she died, the constellation had arranged all this time travel for her. That's why she has a second chance to change everything. The constellation said that it would soon disappear. Birdie must take care of this magical beast, that is, the white squirrel, and he also needs to tell the girl something very important, or rather the reason why she ended up in the past. But as soon as the constellation began its story, the magical time ended, and the voice began to slowly disappear. As a result, she heard nothing. She was left with a small squirrel in her arms and zero information. Well, that's it. Fate is mocking her and letting her know that her happy days will come oh so far away. She can't take care of herself properly, so now she has a ward, a little animal. While she was furious that she hadn't managed to find out anything, she heard strange footsteps in the distance. Birdie thought that they must definitely be monsters. There were definitely monsters in these woods. But, as it turned out a minute later, it was a man. Moreover, his voice was very familiar to the girl. Another minute, and Bertie saw a young man in a black robe in the clearing. He seemed very excited and slightly confused. Just in case, the squirrel raised her hands up, showing that she had no weapons. She was absolutely harmless. Who knows what this man needs, and why he wanders alone in the forest? Bertie expected anything from the stranger, but not that he would start laughing loudly. He was not only suspicious, but also very strange. What was the point of this laughter? What was so funny about her being kidnapped? To top it all off, it started pouring rain at that very moment. That was the last thing this stupid situation needed. Bertie took a step to leave, but the stranger ordered her to stay put. Then the young man told the girl not to worry. He would simply rid her of this monster, that is, destroy the squirrel. But she screamed and hid the little animal in her arms. This is not just a regular forest squirrel, but a very important magical beast. It was sent to her by a special constellation, and Bertie must take good care of it. Therefore, she will not let anyone hurt the squirrel. Bertie began to tearfully beg the boy not to harm the little creature. If the squirrel died, she would never be able to contact the magical constellation, and she desperately needed it. The stranger, surprisingly, very quickly agreed not to touch the animal. The rain continued to pour down, and Bertie began to sneeze from the cold. She was almost completely soaked and very cold. The boy extended his hand to the little girl and asked her to follow him. He couldn't continue standing in the rain. It wouldn't take long for him to catch a cold, and he really didn't want that, so he had to help the young lady. Bertie frankly told the young man that half an hour ago she had thought him odd, and now that he had called her a lady, she thought him even odder. And where would he take her to get out of the rain? But the guy said RT looks just as weird. Her clothes don't match the weather at all, and she carries a bag with a weird little animal inside, so which one looks weirder? He opened one side of his cloak and offered the girl to hide there. He said that he had seen a forest house not far from here. He could take her there to dry off and wait out the storm. A few minutes later, the stranger and the little squirrel were already opening the door to a small house. It was the hunter's temporary home. At that time, the house was empty, which was very convenient. Thanks to the huge raincoat of this strange man, she did not get wet and even warmed up a little, which could not be said about him. The guy was soaking wet, but for some reason he was smiling. Bertie was well aware that the stranger was very cold. He was shivering, but trying his best not to show it, so she suggested that he take off his wet cloak. She can't let him get sick, otherwise she'll feel guilty about it, and if he doesn't want to show his face, she's ready to turn away so he can take off his hood. The boy thought for a while. It would indeed be a good idea to take off his cloak. So, when the girl turned away, he pulled back the hood and then told her that she could turn back. So Bertie thought the man didn't want her to see his face. And that's not it. He asks her to turn around, and when she turns back, the first thing she sees is a black blindfold on the man's eyes. Even though he was blindfolded, the young man turned out to be a real handsome man. A few minutes later, he brought an armful of firewood and lit the fireplace so that they could dry out and warm up near the fire. She caught herself thinking that she had been standing there for quite some time now, just staring at the young man. If he had noticed, the situation was extremely awkward. She was left alone with him in a small house in the middle of the forest. The stranger seemed to know everything here because he quickly lit a fire and took out everything he needed. Then he turned to the girl, calling her a young lady again, and asked her to move closer to the fire so it would be warmer. Squirrel's cheeks turned pink. It was unclear whether it was because of the warmth or because she was shy. The man knelt down and offered to carry her closer to the fireplace if she had trouble walking on her own. The situation was getting more and more heated by the minute, and now Bertie was no longer pink, but rather bright red. What is he saying? Actually, she can walk on her own. It is not necessary to carry her in your arms. The stranger smiled mysteriously, and poor Squirrel got completely angry and looked at him from under her brows. He was so handsome that she couldn't even be offended by him normally. She had read about such people in books. They were called womanizers. Before, Bertie couldn't understand how people could fall into the hands of such fatal men, losing all their wealth and dignity. But with such an appearance as this stranger, it is very easy to do. The guy leaned very close to the girl, and she felt his breath very close to her. Even though he had a blindfold on, the girl knew he was looking right at her. He asked what the young lady was thinking about. The girl did not understand at all how to react to such actions of this womanizer. She had no power, no money. What benefit would he get from her falling in love with him? She had to be constantly on guard. She thought she should move as far away as possible, otherwise the boy would hear her stomach growling. She hadn't eaten anything since morning. Birdie hoped that the sound of the rain would drown out all other sounds, and she would be able to cover up all this awkwardness. For some reason, Birdie remembered breakfasts and lunches at the Duke's house. There was always plenty of food on the table because Carlise loved to eat well. That's why she was always capricious and refused various delicacies. The guy sat quietly, said nothing, just smiled sweetly. He understood perfectly well that the girl was hungry, and it wasn't the rain at all, but the sounds coming from her stomach. How stubborn she was. Why didn't she just say everything straight out? A minute later, he took a small bag out of his pocket and handed it to the squirrel. When she opened it, she saw small, sweet cookies. How opportune that was. Now she wouldn't die of hunger. This stranger took care of that too. She thanked the guy, then took one cookie, broke it in half and handed one half to the man. But he politely declined. It turned out that he didn't like such snacks, and he wasn't hungry anyway. At this point, Birdie had a logical question. If he wasn't hungry and didn't like sweets at all, then why was he carrying a bag of such a treat in his pocket? Or was he used to feeding all the homeless and needy? The girl was so engrossed in her food that she decided to think about it later. The cookies were really delicious, so she devoured them one after another without paying much attention to etiquette. When it was quiet and Birdie had finally had her fill of the goodies, she heard a rumbling sound. And it wasn't coming from her stomach. How stupid of her. The boy was hungry too. He just didn't feel comfortable telling her. The girl immediately began to apologize. She felt extremely stupid. How shameless, she ate everything and did not leave a crumb. But the guy said that it was not a problem. When the rain stopped, he would go hunting. Birdie automatically looked out the window. What was this fool talking about? It was raining cats and dogs, and it seemed like it would never stop. What was she supposed to do in such a situation? She had to think of something fast. The guy was very hungry and was suffering from inconvenience because of her. She looked out the window again and noticed the plants that were sticking out from under the snow. Yes, it was tuberosum, so she found a solution to the problem. Without thinking twice, Birdie ran out into the street. The guy didn't even have time to ask her what happened. She was running away, but he still decided not to interfere. She wouldn't be able to run far. They were deep in the forest. The next minute, the girl was already getting berries together with stems from under the snow. She remembered very well that you can't eat these elements separately. You can get poisoned. Now she will feed her savior and also save him from hunger. Birdie picked a whole bag of berries and returned to the house. Seeing this, the stranger asked her if she knew what kind of plant it was and what its properties were. She replied that she knew about it very well and was glad that tuberose grew right here. The guy was a little surprised. She knows it's poisonous, but she still wants to feed it to him. Does she have a murder plan? Why is she trying to kill him? He helped her escape certain death. So he asked a direct and logical question. The guy asked why the girl was trying to poison him with these berries. She looked at him with bewilderment. What was he even talking about? She was trying to help. The girl was taken aback for a moment. Why did he think that? But then it dawned on her. Apparently the guy didn't know that if you eat tuberosum with the stems, its poisonous properties disappear and it becomes quite useful. So Birdie explained to the boy that there was no evil intent in her actions. This plant is called the devil's seed, and everyone thinks that it is very dangerous, but you can eat it without any problems. Then she told us how to eat these berries correctly. Under no circumstances should you throw away the stems. They are not poisonous, and that is where the antidote is. So everything is fine. No one will get poisoned. The guy listened to her attentively. It seemed that the girl was absolutely pure. She had no reason to take and wish him death. So he let go of the piece of the stem and swallowed it, and then reached for the berry itself. After the wallpaper had satisfied its hunger, there was silence again. To break it up a bit, Birdie suggested that the stranger look at the house. They were new here, so it was interesting to see what was where. It is not clear why, but the girl's mood improved. She wandered around the house, and the guy silently followed her, watched and smiled. She stopped being afraid of him at all, on the contrary. She felt safe next to him. Bertie looked at different boxes, looked into all the cracks. She was interested in absolutely everything, and the young man watched and thought that she had not changed at all, remained the same as before. Her eyes are just as black and bottomless. You can look into them forever and drown in the dark depths. Absolutely nothing has changed since then. She remains just as sweet and curious. He was terribly afraid of giving himself away. When they met, the guy almost let slip that he still remembered the girl, but she must not know under any circumstances. He would hide it until the very last moment. While he was deep in thought, the girl ran to the window and then shouted to her rescuer that the rain had stopped. The sun was shining outside again. They could go out and take a walk. It was wonderful. He also went to the window to make sure that the weather was fine. Everything was going very well. He would be home in time for breakfast and would remain unnoticed. Suddenly, voices were heard outside. It was the guards from Aslan's castle, who were already running around looking for the girl. Bertie called out that she was in the house and that she was all right. The girl turned to the man and said that they had come for her. She offered to go down the mountain together, and her guards would help him get home. But the stranger politely refused and quickly said goodbye. He disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared in the forest. She didn't even have time to ask his name. She could have sent him gifts with gratitude. It even became awkward. She can be so impolite. The guards' cries were getting closer to the house. The knights already knew that the squirrel was there. They even saw her silhouette. One of them shouted to the young master that the girl had found it. Fortunately, she was safe and sound. A minute later, the young duke burst into the house and grabbed the squirrel by the shoulders. The guy was terribly scared, but when he saw that his little sister was unharmed, he calmed down a little. He was so worried about her and would not leave her unattended again. The stranger did not go far. He hid behind the trees and began to observe the situation. The guy saw perfectly well how Duke Aslan treated the little girl, and he also learned that the baby's name was Bertie. Why does everyone call her Little Mistress? Isn't she a servant? The little one doesn't look like a child of nobles at all. Her manners are completely different from those of children from high society. Okay, for now he will hide and watch. Then the stranger noticed the young man who was standing next to the girl. So the little girl is somehow connected to the Aslan family because he is the son of Duke Leonhart. We will need to find out more about him. Finally, Carlos saw the little animal that, according to the guards, had stolen his little sister. As strange as it may sound, the kidnapper fit in the girl's palms. But now he would deal with him. He asked Bertie to give him the squirrel. The death of this little animal will be quick and painless, he promises. Well, the girl covered the squirrel with her hands and said that she would never let anyone hurt him. Why is everyone trying to destroy this little animal? How heartless they are. She tried to explain to the guy that this squirrel is absolutely harmless and does not pose a danger. On the contrary, he is very scared and asks for help. She will protect him because he is a way to communicate with the constellation. Suddenly, Bertie felt a little sick. She felt dizzy, and everything around her was blurry. The next minute, she lost consciousness and fell into the snow. The poor squirrel was spinning around her and squeaking. She remembers everything else as if she were in a delirium. Carlos took her in his arms, and they descended from the mountains to the palace in a flash. At that very hour, the best doctor was called into Bertie's room to examine the baby. After some time, the doctor was already explaining to the young duke that the baby's body was very different from a lion's, and now it was very weak. In addition, she had caught a cold, probably caught it during the rain. Carlos looked at his beloved Fluffy, and it hurt him a lot. How could she get a fever from a simple rain? Thank God she is not injured, and they will cure the cold in a few days. The young duke had the whole house in an uproar. The doctor was sent back to Bertie's room even if the girl was just sneezing. The boy had never been sick and wouldn't understand what a common cold was. And he also didn't understand how his sister, the daughter of the most powerful duke in the empire, could be so weak. Representatives of the lion family never get sick, and here is such an adventure. But on the other hand, she is not quite a lion. He sat down next to the girl's bed and watched her breathe evenly and her eyelashes twitch in her sleep. Next time, he would definitely protect her. This would never happen again. She would be under his constant supervision. Bertie sneezed again. And since there was absolute silence in the house, so as not to disturb the girl's peace, the entire servants came running to this sound again. And again they dragged tea, warm blankets, and a bunch of medicines into the room. The servants were very worried about the girl's condition. Firstly, the little squirrel was very sweet and kind to everyone. Secondly, the young duke would skin them alive if something happened to the little girl. The girl was starting to get really angry about this situation. Yes, she liked the attention, but not that much. She was just lying there with a cold, but there was always someone near her bed. They even monitored whether she was breathing normally. Who would like that? The next morning, Joanna came into Bertha's room. The girl felt much better, but the woman asked her to stay in bed. She needed to gain strength and improve her health. Closer to dinner, Bertie overheard a conversation between two maids. According to them, the girl realized that Duke Leonhardt was returning to the palace with his knights. Would she really be lucky enough to see her father? But to do this, she had to get out of the room. Without saying anything to the maids, Bertie simply got out of bed. She would not miss her chance and would see her father at any cost. The maids understood her perfectly, but asked her to be very careful. One of the maids reported that all the fuss in the house was connected with the arrival of Duke Leonhardt. He would soon appear at the castle, and he was coming because of the incident with the arson of a warehouse with food and ammunition for his army. And the girl added that everyone was talking about how smart she was. After all, if she hadn't revealed the secret of tuberosum, many soldiers in their army would have simply died, not because of battles, but because of hunger. And the war was about to end. Finally, her actions are beginning to yield positive results. The army will not retreat, but on the contrary, will make progress in breaking through the enemy front. And most importantly, she will be able to see her father. If you think about it, she did all this solely out of love for her father and her own safety. She needs to take revenge on her vile aunt, as well as the traitor Ritter, and she will definitely do it. But saving her life and trying to change everything this time, she helped many people, and this could not but please the little heart of the kind and brave squirrel. But that's not all. There are many good deeds ahead. The girl blushed a little again from her thoughts, but the maids thought that the baby's temperature had risen again, and they had to put her back to bed. The little mistress couldn't get sick again. The next morning, Bertie woke up to the sounds of shouting coming from the street. Going to the window, the girl saw a lot of people. They were shouting and greeting someone. Could it really have happened, and the army and the Duke had returned home? How joyful were the warriors' faces. They had spent 5 long years on the battlefield, had not seen their homes or families, and now they had finally returned to their families. Many of them had no longer dreamed of seeing their families again. Most of the warriors wanted to see the little lady. After all, they considered her their savior. If this smart little girl had not revealed the secret of tuberosum, they would have died of starvation. The squirrel asked the maid to give her the most beautiful dress and comb her hair. She had to meet her father with dignity. Yes, she was incredibly worried, and that was understandable. The woman quickly tidied up the girl. She said that she would do everything perfectly because everything suits Bertie, and even in her pajamas she looks very cute. But she also asked the little girl not to worry, because it was very noticeable. Well, the woman had certainly gone too far with the pajamas. She had to meet her father in her best form. She had read in books that first impressions were of great importance, and she had to please the Duke at all costs. When the servants announced that the master had arrived at the palace, the girl immediately went downstairs. The entire staff had already gathered there, as well as the manager, Joanna, and her brother Carlos. Bertie felt a little superfluous. The doors opened and Leonhardt appeared on the threshold. Loud cheers were heard. Everyone congratulated the gentleman on his victory and the end of the war and on his return home. Leonhardt nodded and smiled slightly. Bertie stood there, afraid to move. This was her strong and courageous father, the talk of the continent. His eyes were like bright gold and radiated a powerful energy, just like Carlos's. She really hoped that her father wouldn't get angry with her and wouldn't chase her out of the castle in front of everyone. But the fear didn't go away. She felt that the man was looking straight at her, but she couldn't stop trembling and raise her eyes. The girl closed her eyes in fear as the Duke approached her at arm's length. Now he would hit her, as her aunt always did, and then he would tell her to get out of his lands and back to the capital. And the man really did reach out to the girl, but not to hit her. He hadn't seen his daughter for over 5 years. She had grown so much and become such a cutie. He wanted to stroke her hair. But this did not happen because Carlis came up to them out of nowhere and greeted his father. Then he congratulated him on his victory and return. He, as always, was absolutely calm. The father also greeted his son. He thanked him for saving the food situation. Otherwise, the army would not have been able to win. His help is hard to overestimate. But the boy came up to Bertie and said that he had almost no merit in this. It was all Bertie's idea. It was she who found out about the antidote in the stems of tuberosum. She suggested collecting the plants and sending them to the front. And Bertie decided not to wait, but to make a statement. So she turned to her father and said that she had discovered the plant's properties. But that was not all. Tuberosum had not yet revealed its full potential. Leonhardt looked at the girl with a slightly irritated expression. Why was she calling him the head of the family and addressing him so formally? Maybe she wasn't familiar with the traditions of this house, or maybe she wasn't feeling well. He leaned over to the manager, Joanna, and said that he felt a little awkward talking to Squirrel in front of so many strangers. He asked her to take her to a room, and they could talk in private tomorrow. The woman took the little girl aside and said that the Duke was very tired after a long journey. It would be better if they met tomorrow and talked about everything calmly. Besides, she would have time to prepare. The circumstances were perfect. Her father is a very serious man and will not listen to any nonsense. And today, Balochka is too excited to express her thoughts clearly and logically. After all the greetings, Duke Leonhardt went to his study. There was no time to rest. A lot of paperwork had accumulated that could not wait. His assistant entered the study and showed some information. The country's economy needs to be sorted out, and foreign traders need to be dealt with. Then Joanna came in and reported that the little lady had had her supper and gone to bed. The girl no longer had a fever. The man thanked the woman, leaned back in his chair, exhaled loudly, and closed his eyes. This little girl is too fragile. She needs to be well taken care of. But despite her age, she is so smart. Bertie had changed a lot since their last meeting. She had grown up, but she was still the same sweet girl. He, although he didn't show it, was very proud of what she had become. She had a lot of energy and courage, just like lions. He wanted so much to take her in his arms and hold her tightly, but he was too shy to do it in front of everyone. And Bertie stood in front of him, trembling all over. She was definitely afraid of him. The Duke asked if he looked threatening. Joanna hesitated for a long time and did not know how to say something so as not to offend or anger the man. But his assistant honestly said that the Duke's appearance was so frightening that many were even afraid to look him in the eye. The guy said that Leonhardt strikes fear not only into the hearts of his enemies, but even the closest people who know him well are afraid of him. His gaze makes everyone tremble, and his icy voice simply kills. After such revelations from his assistant, the Duke became a little despondent. Now he did not seem fierce and all-powerful. Rather, he looked tired and broken, and he is the same person as others, with the same feelings. How to win the trust and love of his little daughter? He had to think of something. It shouldn't look intrusive, and the Duke decided to prepare something to fix the situation. Leonhardt wrote something on sheets of paper for a long time, and then called his assistant and asked him to prepare everything for the meeting with Bertie tomorrow. When he saw the notes, the guy smiled and said that he would prepare everything. In the morning, the little squirrel was restless. She put on her best dress, braided her hair, and went down to the living room. It was impossible to say that the fear and worries had passed. She was still nervous before the important conversation with Duke Leonhardt. When Bertie approached the table, her mouth dropped open in surprise. Why were there so many unique sweets here? Had the chef decided to organize a dessert exhibition in honor of the arrival of the main gentleman? Or maybe today was some kind of holiday? The Duke's assistant immediately ran up to the girl. He helped the little girl sit down at the table and politely asked what delicacy she would like to start with. Mr. Leonhardt had prepared all of this for her. As it turns out, the Duke hired the country's most famous pastry chef to prepare all these treats for his little daughter. Each dessert is unique. Everyone sat down at the table, but instead of eating, they looked at the little lady. They all asked the girl to eat more, to try each sweet and choose the ones she liked the most. After some time, the girl decided to get down to business. Breakfast dragged on. She thanked him for the treat and said that she had come down here not only to have breakfast, but also to settle a very important matter. The Duke looked at the girl carefully. It seemed that she had inherited his courage and stubborn character. The little girl knew exactly what she needed and why she had come here. That was why the man said that he was ready to listen to her. Birdie said that she has been collecting information about the northern lands for quite a long time. Now it is becoming obvious that the flow of people to these territories has decreased significantly recently, and this has a negative effect on the development of the region. Leonhardt asked how the girl got such precise and analytical information. She had only just arrived, but Birdie could not tell that she had spent a lot of time wandering around the area as a squirrel. It was much easier to gather the necessary information that way. The little girl continued, "The mountains that surround the lands of the Duchy of Aslan create an impenetrable defense, but on the other hand, they greatly interfere with any agriculture. Therefore, the inhabitants have to buy food from external sources." But even after the end of the long and painful war, the girl believes that the situation in these lands will not improve. Soon, the prices for food crop seeds will rise significantly. Birdie knew this very well, because she had already been to the future and experienced all the hardships of the post-war years. She remembers it because the servants almost stopped bringing her food, but the girl is here precisely to solve the duchy's food problem, and she knows exactly how to do it. She has already managed to save people, and she will not stop there. All she needs is to stay in the castle. Much to Birdie's surprise, the Duke listened to her rather indifferently. Then the man told her not to worry about it. He had already solved the problem and would buy food in the neighboring kingdom of Sadis. They have rich lands. On the cold server, a fierce winter comes every year. This is what the Duchy of Aslan is known for on their continent, and also for the constant invasions of other lands. The Duke loved to seize other people's weak territories. She heard the assistant say that if the neighboring states did not want to trade with them, they would simply take their food by force. Now Birdie understood why the lands of Aslan were called the lands of bandits. The girl tried to object. According to the elders, a terrible drought is approaching. The peasants will not cope with this problem. How will they take the supplies of their neighbors if they also have nothing? Birdie hinted once again that not all problems can be solved by force. That is why she came up with an alternative solution to this problem. All that is needed is for the Duke to listen to her to the end. The next moment, the girl handed her father a pot with a small green plant. Looking closely, the man realized that it was a tuberosum. It is usually perceived as a weed by the road. Why did she put it in a flower pot? The Duke smiled. The flower in the pot looked like the most precious gift. The girl had taken the trouble to grow it for Leonhardt. She probably wanted the duchy to start growing tuberoses on an industrial scale. Count Gellet smiled and politely objected. Even the most patient soldiers couldn't eat that potion for long. They'd been eating it for almost a month already. And to be honest, it tasted really bad. The girl seemed to read the manager's thoughts. She asked if he was worried about the taste of the tuberosum berries, and immediately continued that she had solved this problem long ago. It turns out that one plant is not enough. Then she took the napkin off the plate, and everyone present stared at its contents. There was soup. It was very attractive in appearance and gave off a wonderful aroma. The girl saw the reaction perfectly and said that this soup was made from tuberosum. The recipe is not complicated, but she and Joanna had to work hard to bring the dish to the desired taste. Suddenly, the Duke jumped up to the girl and nervously asked if she had tried the dish yet. Birdie calmly replied that she had eaten a whole plate. She couldn't introduce the soup to others without trying it herself. The Duke didn't even listen to what Birdie said next. He shouted for the head doctor to be called to the palace right now because the little girl had eaten soup made from a poisonous plant. If she wasn't helped in time, she would die from poisoning. Birdie was even a little scared by the man's reaction. How could she explain to them all that this food was absolutely safe and had been tested many times? She was making sure that there was no food crisis in the duchy. And here it was, the solution to this problem. Birdie looked at her father again for the 10th time that morning and said that she was fine. But he said that she was not at all like him and his brother. Birdie was too small and fragile, so the potion could harm her. For some reason it hurt and felt a little strange to hear such words from her own father. He said that the girl was not like him. When others said this, it was not so offensive. But now tears were treacherously coming to her eyes. But on the other hand, if the father didn't care about his own daughter, he wouldn't have asked to call a doctor and wouldn't have worried so much about her condition. So, after all, she means something to him. Or maybe this opinion is wrong. What if the Duke is worried about something completely different? Maybe he is afraid of rumors that his daughter was poisoned in a strange way. Why does he need unnecessary gossip and shame for the family? Bertie felt completely defeated. Perhaps her father had called the doctor simply because he did not trust her. If so, she would not be able to convince him that this method was simple and effective enough. While the father and daughter were arguing, they did not notice the doctor entering the room. Everyone stepped aside so that he could examine the little lady. A few minutes later, the man stated that the girl was absolutely healthy. Bertie could have gloated, but she didn't. On the contrary, she thought that Northerners were very strange people. They called a doctor for every little thing. It seemed to her that these people were overly sensitive about their health. When the doctor left, the little squirrel decided to continue the conversation with her father. The problem with food and provisions in the north has not been solved. Everyone needs to calm down and listen to each other's suggestions. When Leonhardt said that he was ready to listen to the girl further, instead of words, she put several more dishes on the table in front of the men. It was tuberose baked in sauce, a tuberose salad, and a light dessert made from the same berry. Bertie smiled and said that these were far from all the dishes that she could make from this plant. The menu was very varied, and most importantly, all these dishes were delicious and gave a feeling of satiety. Besides this, the girl noticed that there are some other very important factors. These are the taste, price, and availability of tuberosum. The plant has all these advantages. Therefore, hunger in the north is no longer a problem. Bertie saw how surprised everyone was by her action, and this made the girl very happy. She convinced everyone that miracles can be created from ordinary weeds and directed towards the welfare of the duchy. The Duke himself, for some reason, remained unperturbed. It seemed that he still had not fully believed in the sincerity of the girl's intentions. Besides, she kept repeating about some kind of deal between them. What did she mean? What does this brave little squirrel want? A bunch of new expensive toys? Her own huge mansion by the sea? Or does she want the most beautiful star in the sky, which is named after her? But on the other hand, Leonhardt knew perfectly well that whatever this beautiful little girl wanted, he would gladly do absolutely anything. So the man asked what she wanted in exchange for the recipe for her dishes. The girl's answer was immediate. She calmly replied that she would like to stay in her father's castle until she grew up, and if her father allowed it, she would be happy to help in any way she could. There was a moment of absolute silence. It was the hardest moment in Bertie's life. Her fate was being decided. Would she be allowed to stay, or would she be driven away and forced to leave the castle by evening? Leonhardt looked at the girl carefully. Why did she want to stay here? Maybe because of the inheritance, but she would get half of all his property anyway. Maybe there were other reasons. For example, she had a very bad life in the capital. Bertie decided to break the silence and said that she did not need luxurious apartments. She was ready to live in an ordinary servant's room. If this did not suit the Duke, then she would even agree to a basement room. If Leonhardt could blush with shame, he would probably just burn. How could his own daughter say such things? What basement? Wasn't she shown her room? The manager cleared his throat and nervously began to explain that Mr. Carless had personally given the little girl a tour of her apartment, and that was where she had spent her last nights. She had a bunch of servants and a personal maid. To stop the Duke from yelling at the manager, the squirrel decided to intervene in their conversation. She said that her brother had indeed shown her everything, but a more modest room was enough for her. She was not at all accustomed to luxury. All she asks her father is to just let her stay here and not go back to the capital. Bertie thought to herself that this way she could run away anywhere when she grew up, and then she could fulfill her dream of becoming a trader. The Duke was silent again and looked at the little girl. After a long pause, the man said that this would not happen. Bertie's mood immediately worsened. Maybe he should be offered payment for accommodation, or even get a job as a servant in the castle. The little girl was barely holding back her tears and could not understand what the man meant. He simply told her to go to her room and said that it was not customary to pay for accommodation in her own home. It seemed that Bertie had angered her father. So what should she do now? Such a brilliant plan has completely failed. No one is interested in tubarium dishes, and no one is going to leave her in the castle. She will have to start all over again. The girl returned to her room completely disappointed, but the servants were waiting for her there. The maids offered her warm milk, toys, tasty food, sang lullabies to her and tried to cheer her up in any way they could, but it didn't work out very well. Bertie climbed into bed and seemed about to burst into tears. Why was everyone so kind to her, but her own father treated her like a stranger? Did he feel sorry that she would live in her parents' house until she came of age? Meanwhile, Carlos entered the room and, seeing the state of his little sister, became very worried. He asked the maids what the problem was, but they did not know what exactly had upset the little squirrel so much. The guy quietly sat down on the baby's bed and carefully stroked her lush red hair. He asked who had offended the little ponytail, let him just tell, and he would sort it out in no time. Even this strong and self-confident lion was now as kind and gentle as possible to her. If only her father had stroked her hair at least once, she would have been incredibly happy then. When the girl was left alone in the room, she again had the opportunity to think about the situation. Why did everyone continue to take care of her? After all, the Duke had made it clear that it was time for Bertie to leave the castle and return to the capital. At first, she had the goal of staying in her father's castle solely for safety reasons, but it turned out that there were a lot of good people here, and most of them truly loved her. Bertie would very much like to stay and live with them. But to become part of the castle, she had to try again to convince her father to let her stay here. She still couldn't understand what he meant when he said that they didn't pay rent in her parents' house. While Bertie was sleeping peacefully in her bed, the conversation continued in the Duke's study. Joanna reported the little lady fell asleep. She had eaten well during the day, walked, but went to bed early and was very sad. Leonhardt said that everyone had to keep a constant eye on the squirrel and pay attention to every little detail. The little one was very weak. She wouldn't survive the northern cold, and he wasn't going to just watch her suffer. He wanted to bring her back to the capital because it has a wonderful warm climate that helps the body grow, but it turns out she is very lonely there, so Bertie tries his best to stay here in the north. The man's thoughts were interrupted by the manager. Count Jalot suggested that the Duke's daughter would be in the capital in the greatest safety. The Duke may not like to hear this, but he himself understands that this is the best option. Leonhardt didn't even want to listen to the young man. He understood that he needed to think with a clear head, but on the other hand, the little girl missed her parents' home so much that she decided to run away from the Viscountess. His child just wanted to see her father. The Duke's assistant objected. The boy said that small children should live with their parents. Besides, there were plenty of children in the north, all of them healthy and happy, so the cold was no reason to send the little lady back to the capital. The Duke felt like his head would soon burst from his thoughts. He should be strong and calm, but now he looked weak and vulnerable. But still, he would leave his daughter here for a while. The castle would take good care of her. The girl simply cannot be let go. He wanted to see her for so long, not to send her back to the capital. Besides, she is a real genius. Not everyone can try so hard to help solve the food problem. However, the Duke wondered why his sister, Viscountess Farina Sirius, did not report anything to him about this. After all, he had given her clear instructions to report even the smallest details that concerned his daughter. The steward, to the Duke's surprise, began to side with the Duke's sister again. He said that Lady Farina reported to him every day. Perhaps not all the news reached Leonhardt on the battlefield. The woman wrote that there were no problems with the girl. She behaved a little strangely, was withdrawn and taciturn. Perhaps someone else had advised Balochka to run away from her aunt's care. But the Duke's assistant objected again. It was necessary to punish those people who left the little girl unattended. After all, the road to the north was very dangerous. And what if the girl had not endured such a difficult road? Leonhardt ordered increased security and surveillance of Squirrel, and an hour later, his assistant brought to his office all the personal files of those who were close to Bertie, from the lady's protectors in the capital to the reporters. The young man has taken up spying on the servants of Mrs. Farina's estate in the capital especially seriously. He wants to find out what they were doing when the little girl ran away. He has sent his best men to investigate. The Duke thought that the boy was absolutely right. Before sending the girl back to her sister, it was necessary to find those responsible for what had happened. He did not want his daughter to feel bad. Birdie slept very badly that night. She had nightmares about her aunt and the traitor Ritter. It would have been better not to go to bed at all. The governess was already busy in the room, preparing clothes for the little mistress, airing the room. But then the girl smelled a pleasant scent, and turning her head, she saw several huge baskets with beautiful bright yellow flowers. There were so many of them that Birdie could hide among the buds and petals. And she also noticed a huge red toy squirrel. It was very cute, and in its paws it held a golden hazelnut. But where did all this come from in her room? No one came in the evening. Flowers in the north of the country are incredibly expensive because the soil here is barren. Even one flower is beyond the means of an ordinary citizen, and here there are hundreds of them. Who is this person who sent her all this luxury? And the toy squirrel looked like a real giant. Birdie didn't even know that such huge toys existed in real life. How did that squirrel even get through her bedroom door? The maid was touched by this picture. The little girl was hugging a soft toy and trying to take away a golden nut from it. With such a nut, you can even start your own business. The girl asked if Birdie liked the gift from the Duke. The girl immediately froze in place. Her heart began to pound like crazy. Could all this really be from her dad? But why? The maid replied that this was how the general wanted to thank her for the recipes from Tuberosum. She didn't even fully understand whether she should be happy or not. Maybe her father sent her gifts, and then he would order her to pack for the road and go to the capital, although he appreciated the recipes, and that was already very good. For about an hour the girl walked around the room and simply smiled, and then asked the maid to bring her paper and a pen. She wanted to write a letter to her father and ask him for a meeting. Birdie still had not lost hope of establishing relations with him. At first, the little girl thought of passing her message through the maid, but at the last moment she decided to take the letter personally and hand it to the Duke directly. That is exactly what she did. The Duke was sitting in his study. He looked rather thoughtful. He took the letter and asked if she could read it right away. Birdie nodded. She was not afraid of her father's anger, because the text of the message was warm enough. The man smiled faintly. He wanted so much to take this red-haired girl in his arms and hug her. What could the little girl have written with her tiny hand? Probably words of gratitude for the toys. To the Duke's great disappointment, there were no words of admiration or gratitude. His daughter wrote down several more recipes and technologies for preparing Tuberosum. This is, of course, good, but he expected something else. Here the girl cleared her throat and said that she decided to thank her father in person and not with a letter. She really liked the gifts, but the best gift for her would be permission to stay in the north. Leonhardt's expression immediately changed. He became serious and cold, and then replied that he would never allow her to stay in the castle. In time, she would understand why he was doing this. What was a little girl to do? The negotiations were at a dead end. She asked to leave her here until she came of age. Her task now was to convince her father to stay with him for at least a month. He voiced his stupidest idea. He said that he would build the same castle for her in the capital. It has an unusual architecture because its walls go not only underground, but also inside the surrounding mountains. Of course, due to the special landscape in the capital, the builders will not be able to recreate the structure 100%, but the Duke will order, and they will try to make it as similar as possible. The girl lowered her head so that the man would not see that she was about to burst into tears. Then Birdie said that there was no need to build anything in the capital. She could not go back to where the people she had run away from lived. She understood perfectly well that if she appeared in the capital again, Auntie and Ritter would definitely find a way to kill her. And who knows if she would have a chance to save herself again? A minute later, Birdie stood up and said that she was capable of helping the Duke in waging war. After all, there were often wars with neighbors in the north. She was a very good strategist and had already proven it. The Duke wanted to laugh. She might be a good strategist, but he would have to assign half the army to guard her. She was really very nice, but leaving her in the north was too dangerous. He didn't answer anything, nothing specific. He just said in a tired voice that he had another meeting in a few minutes, so they should finish the conversation. Besides, the squirrel needed to rest. The man stood up and very gently stroked Birdie's fluffy red hair. He did it with such trepidation that the girl was afraid to breathe. But it didn't last long. The man removed his hand, turned around, and left without a word. Bertha stood in the study for a while longer, unable to move. Then she touched her head in the places where the Duke's hand had touched her. For the first time in her life, her father showed any warm feelings towards her. The Duke was absent from the castle for the next few weeks, but not a day passed without gifts from him. And every day there were new surprises, expensive dresses, toys, jewelry, souvenirs. Bertie did not regard these gestures as ordinary kindness. It seemed to her that this callous man was hinting to her that it was time to know when to stop. She didn't need all these valuable things. The greatest value for her was the Duke's love. So Bertie decided to take a radical hard way, to speak to the man all the gifts from Leonhardt in a large cart and brought to the man's office. It turned out to be quite a lot. She barely got through the door. Bertie managed to impress her father. He was very surprised and asked what it all meant. The little girl calmly replied that she had brought all his presents and wanted to return them back to the Duke. The man asked for an explanation. He thought that the girl really liked the things he had given her. Well, she replied that she needed a completely different gift, and that was permission to stay in her parents' house. The Duke looked thoughtfully at Bertie, who was briskly unloading a cart with various boxes. How he regretted that he had not been a part of her life. He had not seen her grow up, had not hugged her, had not played with her. He had missed her entire childhood. The last time he held her was when she was 1 year old, but it seemed like yesterday. The more he looked at Bertie, the less he wanted to let the baby go. Winter hasn't come yet, and even in the north it's still summer. Maybe he should let the little one live here until the cold weather sets in. And then he'll definitely think of something and send her back. More than anything else, the man was afraid of showing his weakness and true feelings towards this little girl. He put on a mask of seriousness and said in a calm voice that he would allow Bertie to stay in the castle until winter. The little girl's happiness knew no bounds. Had she really managed to melt the ice in the heart of this majestic man? So there was hope that her father loved her at least a little bit. Maybe she would be able to convince him to keep her until the summer. She wanted so much to run up to the Duke and hug him tightly, but she restrained herself with all her might. There was just over a month left until winter, and she needed to think of something to stay here longer. Then the Duke asked the girl to collect all her gifts and take them back to her room. He gave them to her so that she would receive positive emotions, and he would be offended if she returned them. The girl nodded her head quickly and then, unexpectedly for herself, leaned toward the man's ear and asked him to give her a simple fatherly hug and the opportunity to spend more time together instead of a bunch of gifts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in the capital of the kingdom of Astrum, a big celebration was beginning. There were many people on the streets, and the atmosphere seemed very lively. The city life, as always, was in full swing. Guards lined up on the main street, and a few minutes later the imperial carriage appeared, in which His Majesty and his wife were seated. The people shouted and greeted the head of state. Nader Dux Astrum, the king of the state, was still quite young. He sat majestically in his carriage and smiled at the citizens. They all thanked him for stopping the war and giving the people some peace. But, having listened more closely to what the townspeople were shouting in the crowd, the emperor felt quite uneasy. Why were they exalting Duke Aslan? Why not him, but the northern leader of the lands, the glorious commander, Duke Leonhardt? The woman tried to calm the emperor and asked him not to pay attention to the cries of the stupid people. They do not understand anything about military strategy. The head of the country should not be on the battlefield. He leads the state. And the emperor's companion also said that she had a very good plan to get rid of the annoying duke, but she needed to be listened to carefully. To do the job perfectly, you need to be a master in your field. Meanwhile, Count Gelat was receiving an unknown man in his office in the middle of the night, and it seemed that the steward was somewhat alarmed. He asked the stranger not to come to the castle for some time so as not to arouse suspicion. The man didn't seem to be too worried about it. He smiled at the count and said that everything was fine. He was there in complete secrecy and no one had seen him. He had thought everything through in advance, down to the smallest detail. Not a single living soul in the castle knows that his own daughter set fire to the warehouses with provisions and weapons for Duke Leonhardt's army. She carried out the order and died as agreed. Her body, of course, was never found. Count Gelet looked at the man with a serious expression. Why was he telling him this? Was he expecting sympathy? But they had agreed on everything in advance. Both he and his daughter knew what they were getting into. So the conversation was inappropriate. The man was silent for a minute. He seemed to be considering the manager's claims. Then he said that he was not asking for pity on his dead daughter, but he would like to receive the promised payment for his services. They had also agreed on this in advance. His daughter took care of her younger brothers and sisters and helped her father a lot with the housework. So if Count Gelet provided funds for the maintenance of his younger children, then his eldest daughter would sleep peacefully in the afterlife. He asked for nothing more. The manager looked at the guest with a piercing gaze once more and asked him to come to the table. He opened the cabinet himself, pretending to take money out of it. He said that his gratitude would be very great and that the man did not even expect such generosity. The next minute, when the stranger approached the table, Gelet with a sharp movement took a dagger from the nightstand and plunged it into the man. This was his reward for the job done. Then the killer asked to say hello to his daughter. Then the count called his faithful assistant and asked him to remove the man's corpse from the office. He nodded silently and then said that a guest was waiting for him in the living room. It was a woman who had come to him from the capital. Gelet's mood immediately changed. He did not expect that the lady would personally pay him a visit and decide to go from the capital to the far north, but there was nothing to be done. He would have to receive the woman with all honors. Meanwhile, Bertie was busy writing a letter to her father. She needed to convince the Duke to let her stay in the castle as long as possible. Preferably, he would allow the girl to live here until she came of age. But for some reason, Bertie couldn't come up with anything useful. She couldn't concentrate or find the right words, so she decided to change the environment and turned into a fluffy red squirrel. The frosty air and the open space were indeed good for her. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. How she loved this harsh and cold land. She was loved here. She remembered the capital and thought that the center of the cold was there. Even Aunt Farina's servants despised her there. When they saw her, they became angry and drove her to the farthest corner of the house. In such cases, she climbed to the highest branch of the tree so that no one could see her, much less reach her. She enjoyed the silence, listened to the sound of the wind and put her thoughts in order. And now she climbed to the very top of the tree. But the next minute it turned out that from this place, the window of Duke Leonhardt's office was clearly visible. The man was sitting at the table and working with papers. The girl listened. Her father was talking to his assistant. They were talking about her. The Duke was studying the origin and meaning of her name. The word Bertie meant blessed with happiness. Every time the man said his daughter's name out loud, a genuine smile appeared on his face. He did not choose the name for his child, but it turned out that the girl introduced herself. She called herself Bertie, not even knowing that it was his favorite female name. It always evoked warm and tender feelings inside. It's a pity that he didn't give her this name. I wonder why his daughter chose it. The assistant looked out the window and saw the branches of the tree near the window swaying. The boy suggested out loud that there was someone there, but the Duke replied that it was just the wind, and he opened the window in case Squirrel wanted to come in to see him. Bertie was shocked by what she heard and saw in the window. It turned out that her father had been thinking about her name all this time. She had received it in her past life, before her resurrection, and it seemed to her a symbol of deep indifference. And now she was 8 years old again, and she knew that despite the endless wars, her father never stopped thinking about her. He never forgot her for a minute. He remembered her, but there must have been reasons why the Duke never let her know about himself. And the girl assumed that there was hope that her father loved her, even if only a little bit. After all, she had been thinking about him all these years because she truly loved her daddy and wanted to be with him. All the next day, Bertie felt wonderful. She was in high spirits, and the servants could not understand what had happened to their little mistress. She was positively glowing with happiness. The girl had one unfinished strategy. She had to use the secret recipe and bake the most delicious tuberosum cookies for her father. The man would try them and would not be able to resist her request. An hour later, the little girl was heading to the Duke's study, holding a tray of cookies, jam, and tuberosum muffins. She had also prepared her father's favorite tea. This time, the plan would work, but then the worst thing happened. There was a woman standing by the door to her father's office, and Bertie remembered that silhouette very well. She couldn't be mistaken. It was her Aunt Farina. But what the hell? What was she doing here? The girl's arms and legs instantly became weak and the tray flew out of her hands. The cups and plates shattered into pieces, and Bertie simply froze in place. She needed to pull herself together and pull herself together. Otherwise, everything was lost. The woman looked at the baby and smiled sarcastically. Then she said that Bertie was still as clumsy as before. I wonder who she took after. Then the woman came closer and began to deliberately trample on the liver scattered on the floor. The aunt understood perfectly well that by doing so she was hurting the girl very much, because she was trying for her dad. But Betty decided to remain silent and not start a conflict. Then Irina looked intently into the girl's eyes and said that she was very upset by the little girl's escape. She forgives her for the first time, but asks her not to run away from home anymore. Now Bertie clearly realized that she would make every effort to never return to the capital, namely to her aunt's house. She would no longer allow this vile traitor to mock her. So, when Farina wanted to touch Bertie's hair, she abruptly pushed her hand away and asked her never to approach her again. And the woman understood from the girl's expression that she was not joking at all. Her gaze changed, became bold and open. The conversation between the aunt and her niece took place in front of the maids, so the woman decided to smooth things over and said that the little girl had been spoiled in the north. Now she would have to teach her good manners again. But Bertie decided that this time she would not let herself be offended. She shouted at Farina to take off her shoes at once. Their house was very clean, and the woman was dirtying the floor with her dirty shoes. Then Bertie couldn't take it anymore and dropped to the floor to pick up the spoiled cookies. She tried so hard for her beloved daddy, and this evil woman, as always, ruined everything. Why couldn't she stay in the capital? Suddenly, the door of the office opened, and Duke Aslan Leonhardt himself appeared on the threshold. He was very serious and asked what had happened. Auntie's expression changed in a matter of seconds. She put on her sweetest smile. Nothing had changed about the man since he had become the most handsome man in the empire. No, it had. He had become even more attractive. Still smiling, Farida began to bow and greet Leonhardt, and he looked at Bertie and her disappointed look. Perhaps the tray was too heavy, so she dropped it. What a pity! The little one must have tried very hard. It seemed that the aunt would burst with anger. The man did not notice her at all, or simply pretended that he did not see anyone here except Belachka. But why did he ignore her so persistently? Suddenly the Duke noticed that the little girl was looking at the floor and looked there too. There were cookies lying on the ground, and the little girl said that she had made them especially for her daddy. She wanted him to enjoy the delicious taste. The man's eyes widened. What? Was this little girl trying for him? Did she want to please him? The Duke held himself back from crying because this situation touched him to the depths of his soul. His little girl had baked him cookies herself with her own hands, so he leaned over and began to pick up the crumbs with his own hands. Farina's eyes slowly popped out of her head. In order not to remain in an awkward situation, the Viscountess began to make fun of the maids who were watching this whole situation from afar. She laughed that the servants in this castle were very observant, but too lazy. But the Duke sharply asked the woman to stop chatting and not to offend his staff. He would not allow anyone to mock his servants, because they were the same people as the Duke himself. This was a turn of events that the woman had not expected at all. She had gotten herself into an unpleasant situation, and now she looked extremely stupid both in front of the servants and in front of Leonhardt himself. And all because of this vile girl. The girl tried to be as inconspicuous as possible and carefully observed the behavior of her aunt and her father. It seemed that her father was not very happy to see a woman in his house. She managed to anger him in a few minutes. Out of the corner of his eye, the man noticed that Bertie was trying to appear indifferent to the incident, but she was doing a poor job of it. He thought that the child should not see him arguing with the Viscountess. Everyone around him is already afraid of him, and now he is scared a little girl too. Bertie will start to think that he is a real despot and will not want to stay in the castle any longer, and they were just starting to get along. So, in the same steely tone, the man asked the little girl to go to her room. He invited the Viscountess to his office. He had a lot of questions for the woman, and there was little that was pleasant there. Farina smiled again. She was not at all against being alone with the Duke, without this nasty child. Although he was a rather rude man, he was very handsome, and that was what she needed. The woman had expected nothing from the Duke. He was extremely serious, and after a short pause asked Farina to explain. How did it happen that Squirrel ran away from the capital? While the cunning relative tried to wriggle out of it, the situation only worsened. The Duke was not joking at all. He asked why she had allowed the little girl to go alone to the far north. The Viscountess had already decided from the start that she would put all the blame on her niece. That's why the woman started smiling stupidly, said that Bertie was still a child, and that's why she came up with an escape plan for herself. She must have read about it in children's books. Leonhardt was silent. He understood perfectly well that this vile woman wanted to wriggle out of it and get out of this mess dry. It seemed that the Viscountess wanted to shift all the responsibility onto an 8-year-old child. The man understood why his poor little daughter had devised an escape plan and decided to run away from the capital as far as possible. Perhaps that nasty liar treated the little girl terribly. The Viscountess was not used to accepting defeat, so she continued to lie. She reminded him that she wrote to the Duke every month about his daughter's upbringing. Therefore, it was his fault that he did not react. As soon as she discovered that the little girl had escaped, she immediately used the royal magic line to report the incident. As a close relative, she did everything in her power. Leonhardt replied menacingly that he remembered her short letters very well, but unfortunately, for some reason, there was not a single word in them about how talented, smart, and resourceful his little girl was. The current situation was not in the Viscountess's favor at all, and she understood it perfectly well. Where could this nasty and stupid half-breed get any talents? It was just a misunderstanding. But the Duke objected and said that everyone who had had the chance to talk to Bertie praised her for her kindness, honesty, sincerity, and sharp mind. Many of his advisors considered the girl a real genius. The woman frowned. What the hell of a genius? She had never noticed anything like that in this nasty girl. And where would talent come from if after the death of the little girl's mother, Farina threw all the books out of the house? She even ordered the governesses not to bring books into her house and not to teach the girl anything good. The Viscountess fired everyone who disobeyed her. She is not even sure if this stupid squirrel can read. Well, the Duke's last question left the woman stumped. The man asked how she dared to negotiate with the prince about marrying Bertie. He was her father and would decide for himself who his daughter would marry. The man did not believe that this vile woman could have arranged all this on her own. Without a doubt, someone helped her and told her what and how to do, and there is a high probability that the royal family is behind all this. The strongest and most influential in the state was, of course, the royal family of Astrum, and in second place was the Aslan family, which was ruled by Duke Leonhardt. Apparently, the royal family had a plan. If the king's son, Prince Ritter, marries his daughter, then the blood of the two strongest families can be monopolized. Farina went over to the king's side and decided to carry out this plan arbitrarily. She had crossed the line and betrayed his family, so she must be punished. Such actions cannot go unpunished. And what had his little daughter done wrong that she allowed herself to treat her like that? The woman understood that she was in trouble, and if the Duke continued in the same spirit, then a serious execution awaited her. Therefore, she decided to try at any cost to get out of it and convince the man that she was not guilty here, and she decided to act. The Viscountess suddenly fell to her knees and began to sob. She screamed that if her sister were alive, they would not dare to treat her like that in this house. She missed her so much. Doesn't the Duke remember how before her death his wife asked him to take care of her younger sister Farina? So why is Leonhardt now so cruel to her and accuses her of all sins? Leonhardt bowed his head for a moment and thought. Yes, in his last letter, his late wife had asked him to be kind to her sister and support her because she would take care of their daughter. But the Duke suddenly replied that he had tried his best to help Farida. But after his youngest daughter ended up on the street, he no longer wanted to fulfill all the whims of the Viscountess. Enough. The The man said that only because of the fond memory of his wife would he allow his relative to stay in the castle for a while. He ordered the servants to prepare a guest room for her. Farida wanted to burst with anger. She had expected a completely different reception and attitude. Ideally, the Duke would have offered to stay with him forever, and now he even forbade her to take guardianship over this little brat. Her plan had failed miserably. She had cared about Bertie at all only because it was not the Duke who had asked her to, but other people, and she would have benefited greatly from this marriage. But alas, it would not take place. But, as always, there was a backup plan B, and the woman will do everything she is ordered to do in order to get the most courageous and handsome man in the kingdom for herself. She is ready to do anything for this. The woman held up a bottle of purple liquid. She just had to do as she was told, and everything would be fine. It was just time to drink this, and everything would fall into place. In the morning, Bertie felt slightly agitated. Even her maid noticed it. To avoid unnecessary questions, the girl said that she had not slept well, and how else could she sleep if Auntie was here? There was a knock at the door, and a maid appeared on the threshold with a huge box. More gifts from Duke Leonhardt. Soon there would be nowhere to put them. She asked her father not to send anything else, but of course he did not listen. This time, the gift was especially elaborate. The Duke decided to give his little girl a northern silver fox fur coat. It was truly a stunning, unique thing, but the girl felt out of place in this garment. But it turns out that these were not all the gifts. On the table lay an envelope containing a letter from the Duke. He had finally heard her request and written. She would keep this message for the rest of her days. Before her transformation, the girl had never received a single letter from her father. She wrote him hundreds of them, but never received a reply. Even on the day of her coming of age, she did not hear a word from the Duke. Now she had a whole collection of short but so sweet letters from her father. The days when she could only imagine what the Duke's handwriting looked like were already a blur. While the girl was sorting through the letters from Leonhardt, she didn't notice how the door suddenly opened and Auntie appeared on the threshold. She didn't even deign to knock. It wasn't in her rules. The woman also forgot to say hello. Right from the doorway, she ordered the girl to show her something she was hiding in her gold handbag, but Bertie refused. It was her treasure, and they were not for prying eyes. Thank goodness, the evil woman turned her attention to the exquisite fur coat the maid was holding. She immediately ran up to the outfit and tried it on, saying that it would suit her perfectly. But the maid said in a calm and confident tone that the coat was not intended for the Viscountess. It was a gift from the Duke for his young daughter, and probably Mr. Leonhardt would be against anyone trying on Bertie's clothes. Irina didn't expect that they could treat her like that. How could a maid even talk to her in that tone? She wasn't going to steal this fur coat, and she didn't want to try it on. She just decided to touch it with her hands. The maid saw how the girl reacted to the behavior of this rude and spiteful woman, so they decided to calm the little girl down by any means, brought her a tasty morsel and sweets, as well as a bunch of toys. And the girl decided to protect the poor maids, whom the Viscountess scolded for nothing, so she asked the woman to behave as befits guests of the Aslan family. It is not accepted to be rude to servants here. The woman's face instantly twisted. She had been humiliated by this brat, and in front of the servants. If they hadn't been here, this little rat would have gotten a good slap on the back of the head. It was a pity she couldn't do it in front of people. The poor maids felt uncomfortable and asked Bertie not to quarrel with her aunt because of them, but the girl had a completely different opinion. Then she asked them to leave. She needed to talk to this traitor alone. Woman, I don't understand much about the behavior of this nasty little girl. I still don't understand why all the servants, including the Duke, call the girl by the name of Bertie. Who gave her this terrible name? While the Viscountess was lost in thought, the maids had time to leave the room, and she was left alone with her niece. Surprisingly, the little girl was not frightened, but asked what her aunt wanted to tell her. The relative sat down on the sofa demonstratively and said that her niece was behaving inappropriately. She had completely forgotten what upbringing and good manners were. This was all because she had left the capital. The woman continued her game. She said that she heard the girl's name being called. She liked it very much too, and thought it suited her niece perfectly. Farina decided to tell the little girl that in the north there is one very interesting tradition. Here people think that the name is very important, so they deliberately do not give it to unwanted children. And Bertie is an unwanted child. That's why she didn't have a name until she was 8, and the Duke knew it very well, but even now he doesn't talk about it. The woman pretended that she was very sorry and sympathized with the little girl. And then the evil deceiver began to hit her at her weakest point. She said that for the sake of her late sister she had asked the Duke to give her a name, but he had refused and asked the Viscountess not to raise the issue again. Farina reveled in hurting the girl, but she remained calm and listened attentively to the nonsense that this deceiver was spouting. The words of the aunt were very different from what she heard here. She remembers vividly the day she overheard her father and his assistant in his office. He was telling her that he had spent many days choosing a name for his baby girl. I wonder why this woman came north, and why she is lying to her so openly now. Apparently she wants to ruin Bertie's relationship with the Duke, and the little girl tried so hard to finally fix everything and get her father's attention. Even in the capital, the Viscountess did not forget to remind Belotchka every day that her father had forgotten about her. He did not want to see her because he did not love her at all. He did not want a child from her late sister. She had heard these hurtful words which brought tears thousands of times. But now, for some reason, her aunt's repertoire did not touch her at all. She remained calm. Having arrived in the north, she realized that she could trust only herself and her feelings. As a child, she couldn't tell her father how much Viscountess Farina hated her. She was too young and her father was too far away, but after living her life twice, the picture became crystal clear. Woman sinful. She thought that she had offended the girl to the depths of her soul because she stood there and kept silent, but the Viscountess did not understand that Squirrel had long since changed. She would not let herself be offended again. The deceiver hoped that she had done everything right, and the little girl would again hide in the corner and silently carry out all her orders and endure humiliation. It had always been like that, and it should remain like that. And Bertie looked at her aunt and understood that she had been deceiving her all this time. Even in her past life, her words about her father not loving her had taken root in the girl's heart. But now she understood that all this was not true. But now she has no strength to fight this powerful and cunning woman. What can Bertie do to her without money and a roof over her head? It will not be possible to avenge all the insults for now. It is necessary to figure out what is important now. Now it is important to stay in the Duke's castle as long as possible. She agreed with the Duke that she will stay in the north until winter comes, but she needs a little more time, namely until she comes of age. She urgently needs to come up with something else to convince her father to keep her here longer. She needs to be needed, and the tuberosum find is not enough. Something else is needed. So the girl went straight to the Duke's library. There were many books there. She would definitely find something useful in them that would give her a way out of the current situation. There was not a minute to lose. In the morning, the maid came into the room to wake the little girl for breakfast, but was very surprised. Bertie was sitting at the table among piles of books and writing something down. She was very concentrated. Finally, the little girl stood up from the table. A smile played on her face. She seemed completely pleased with herself. In her hands, she held several sheets of paper covered with writing and was going to take them to Duke Leonhardt. One of the maids felt sorry for the poor girl. She had probably been writing all night and hadn't even gone to bed, so the governess suggested that Bertie sleep a little while. She took the letter to the Duke and handed it to him personally. At breakfast, Carlos looked closely at his sister. It seemed to him that she had changed a lot in the last few days, had grown up or something, but today she seemed very tired and too calm. But when the guy asked what had happened to her, she calmly replied that she hadn't slept all night. The brother was surprised. Just one night without sleep and she already looked like a squeezed lemon. Was Kvostik really such a weakling? But the girl was exhausted and so sleepy that she even decided not to react to her brother's jokes. Let him joke, he wasn't doing it out of malice. She already understood that. So there was no point in snapping back. But Carlis decided to stop torturing the little girl and help her. He said that all of Aslan's line are very strong and resilient. Therefore, the girl should not be too different. She needs to try, maybe even train to be perfect. Meanwhile, the maid took a letter from Bertie to Duke Leonhardt's office. He was slightly surprised, but accepted the message. The girl reported that the little girl had not slept all night, had been reading something in books and writing things down. The man frowned. He had asked his daughter to watch her health, to take care of her condition. She was probably very tired if she hadn't slept all night. It wouldn't take long for her to get sick. The maids needed to keep a closer eye on Balachka. Even at first glance, it was obvious that the girl had been in a hurry and had done a lot of work, as her handwriting was sloppy. According to what Bertie had written, a huge disaster was about to happen. The Duke called his assistant Pegus and told him the news. It turned out that this catastrophe could not be prevented or avoided. Human forces here were too weak, and there were very few of them. Since there was very little time left before the disaster, it was necessary to act as quickly as possible. Therefore, Leonhard ordered everyone, including the servants, to gather in his office. They must listen to Squirrel. Closer to lunch, all the inhabitants of the castle were in the Duke's study. The man asked his little daughter if what was written in her calculations was true, because this was a very serious matter. The girl looked at everyone at the table and said that her calculations were correct. This is a future forecast, from which it is clear that the climate on the continent will change radically, and then a real catastrophe will occur for all residents. The manager's expression showed that he didn't believe it, and thought that the girl was just making up stories. It was just a forecast, and forecasts, as everyone knows, often don't come true. Besides, where did the child get such information? The girl foresaw that many questions would arise, so she was well prepared to answer everything as clearly as possible. She had seen this disaster with her own eyes in a past life, but Bertie would keep quiet about this. The little girl opened the records and showed everyone the information that such catastrophes periodically happened on the continent. And ancient scientists wrote about this. They also warned that everything would repeat itself. Accounts said that the continent was gripped by icy cold. All living things froze from the terrible frosts. The waters dried up, and all the plants simply froze in the icy wind. People were not prepared for such changes in nature, so they faced terrible cold and, of course, hunger. Many people died then simply because they ran out of food supplies. Count Gelet intervened in the conversation again. He looked at all this skeptically and said that it was rather stupid to trust the stories of some ancient travelers. One should rely on confirmed facts. The manager continued, "A little girl can't fully understand the climate change situation. Also, we need to check the sources she read this information from. It could be a collection of children's fairy tales." But Bertie was fully prepared for this turn of events. She dragged a stack of books onto the table and suggested that they study the climate research of the scientists of the Kingdom of Astrum together. These men were adults and educated, not like her. Everyone in the office began to look at the scientific records and were extremely surprised that Bertie had managed to find them and systematize all the information about climate change over hundreds of years. Everyone has read that when a blue star rises in the sky, famine and destruction come to the earth. If the Little Ice Age occurs approximately every 200 years, and the last case was in 4860, then a new one will begin very soon. Blue stars are very beautiful and attract the attention of lovers of aesthetics. They look like a blessing from heaven. But in fact, such heavenly bodies foretell a terrible disaster that awaits humanity. In years when blue stars rise in the sky, rain falls less and less frequently. A terrible drought sets in. Even grass and moss stop growing. This in turn causes food shortages. Then comes the coldest winter, which lasts for a very long time, and that is when humanity begins to fight the Great Famine. It is worth thinking about this in order to prevent the approaching disaster. The Duke's advisors suggested that food could be prepared in greater quantities to survive the famine, but Bertie reminded that, in addition to famine, the continent would suffer from long winter colds. Of course, to survive the terrible winter, the first thing you need to do is stock up on a large amount of food, as well as firewood. This is the only way to avoid terrible hunger and stay alive. This was Bertie's plan for the continent. The girl suggests taking tuberosum as a strategic product. They are able to grow this plant and collect its tubers themselves. Therefore, there is no point in buying and bringing supplies from other kingdoms as before. One of the advisors suggested using this plant more actively. It is necessary to find large plots of land suitable for cultivation and grow tuberosum there on an industrial scale. Then the cold winter and hunger will not be terrible for them. Bertie looked at those present. Okay, a start had been made. She had laid out the main part of the information, but the girl was sure that many of the counselors, including the manager Jello, would be against her plan. She recalled that even before her rebirth, her ideas for saving the continent had been rejected several times due to the high risk. At that time, some estates had been completely destroyed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. So this time the squirrel had to make every effort to convince absolutely everyone of the effectiveness of her plan. After all, they still had to organize free soup kitchens for the poor. The first to object to such an idea was precisely Count Gellet. Concern for the people is certainly touching, but such sympathy will lead to the common people becoming lazy. Who will then work for the good of the country? The girl smiled slyly in response. She said that was exactly what you had to do. When trouble came, you had to give alms to the poor. And the Count was probably worried that he wouldn't get any benefit for handing out free food. Bertie looked at the man and said that there are people in the north who do good deeds simply from the bottom of their hearts. And there are those who do not know mercy, and on the contrary, try to use this compassion to earn money. At that moment, the girl realized that it was not in vain that she had reread many books on how to influence people. Now this information was very useful to her. The persuasion technique worked 100%, and people began to listen to her. So the girl leaned over to the Duke and asked him not to worry. No one was going to give away food in public canteens. People would have to earn it. In addition, people will try various dishes from tuberosum and tell their relatives and friends that the plant is not poisonous at all if it is cooked correctly. Thus, in the villages, residents themselves will begin to grow this plant. All the Duke's advisors were stunned by the idea of a little girl. Grown men would never have thought of such a thing, and this little girl developed a whole strategy to save not only the North, but the entire continent. It's a really worthwhile idea. Using such a plan, it was possible to expect that soon tuberose would be on the tables of all the inhabitants of the country. But the managers objected that it would be extremely difficult to convey to people all the recipes, the main ingredient of which would be tuberose. Manager Gelot knew that this little brat was the Duke's daughter, which is why he did not dare to enter into an open discussion with the girl, but he still suggested out loud that the profit from this business was not too optimistic. Information will be their profit. They will collect various information from visitors in free canteens from different parts of the North, and if necessary, on the contrary, they will pass on the necessary information for distribution. The Duke was amazed at the intelligence and insight of his little daughter. Indeed, information could be the most powerful weapon, and he had seen it for himself many times. How proud he was of his little girl. But it wasn't just Duke Leonhardt who was amazed. All the counselors present were slightly surprised. After all, everything was obvious, but none of them could think of such an effective solution to the problem. But there is one more nuance that should be mentioned. Unlike last time when it was necessary to prepare for famine, now the budget should be directed to domestic policy. The Duke nodded. He fully supported his daughter. While the war was going on, most of the budget was spent on her. But now there was no need to spend money on weapons, so there were extra resources. The Minister of Finance confirmed the Duke's words. The economic situation in the country has really improved. The financial situation is quite calm, so there is no need to worry about it. The minister also added that there was now money to fill the barns in the castle to the brim and help ordinary residents of the capital and other cities with food. And Bertie mentally exhaled. Everything had been resolved safely. The girl thought for a moment and decided not to reveal any more information. She would save her most important trump card for another occasion. For now, she would allow the adults to continue to manage the situation. After a long and tense meeting, Bertie decided to go out into the garden and take a little walk. She was terribly tired of proving her case to grown men, so she needed to take a break and get some fresh air. Although the girl was tired, her mood was particularly high. For such deeds, she would most likely be allowed to live in the Duke's castle. And for this, it was worth not sleeping for several nights. The girl was so deep in her dreams that she didn't even notice how a rider rode up to her at great speed and instantly picked her up in his arms. It was Carlos, and he really scared the little girl. The boy said that he wanted to take a walk with his sister to an interesting place, but Bertie was so scared that she thought that she could only take a walk to heaven, and then she would be reborn for the third time. They were racing at such a speed that the girl couldn't even breathe normally, let alone ask her brother to slow down his skakun a little. Never in her life had she experienced extreme sports. The boy did not understand what the squirrel was squealing about. It seemed to him that she was making sounds of delight from fast horse riding, so he began to drive the horse even faster so that his sister would get maximum pleasure. When they stopped, Birdie jumped off her horse and then braced herself with her hands and feet on the ground. She needed to feel the ground beneath her and make sure she was still alive. She felt, to say the least, not very well. The young Duke started joking. He didn't understand what the girl was looking for in the frozen grass. So the guy asked her to stand up, because everything around was much more interesting. With great difficulty, Birdie forced herself to rise from the ground and looked around. A large, beautiful lake stretched out in front of her. It was difficult to take her eyes off it, so the little girl stood there in amazement for a while. Carlos took the squirrel by the hand and led it closer to the water. They saw their reflections in it. The boy said that this was Lake Aslan, and that in the north, not only the mountains are beautiful. The guy from Undertishka looked at the little girl and tried to understand whether she liked this place. Apparently, the girl was enchanted by the local beauty. She could not stop admiring the nature. By and large, the trip was good for her. Birdie really liked the place. She told her brother that she was grateful for the trip. It was a change of scenery and a chance to relax after the meeting in the Duke's office. But she would never ride a horse again. Her brother looked at her in surprise. What was this little girl even saying? She was the daughter of a duke and should be able to ride a horse better than anyone, but Birdie looked the boy in the eye and said that she simply didn't know how to ride. Carlos wasn't exactly surprised. He even seemed a little angry. This little girl was already 8 years old. How could she not ride a horse? How would she go hunting then? Maybe on a pony. But the squirrel was not one to be timid. She decided to give her brother an answer. She may not be so good at horse riding, but she can quickly pick berries and fruits and climb trees very well. Carlos looked at the little girl with some disappointment. During this time, he had come to love his fluffy little sister. But still, although she was cute, she was very similar to just an ice cube. He really wanted to help the girl. The young Duke asked the squirrel how she was going to survive in this harsh northern land. To live here, you need to have certain skills and, of course, very good health. Not everyone can adapt to the cold here. The girl saw that the young Duke was slightly upset and asked why. He took a miniature bow and arrows from his bag. It was a gift for the squirrel in case she wanted to hunt in the forest, but hunting is always done on horseback. Birdie decided not to disappoint her brother. He really did try to please her. So the girl said that she would be happy to train, learn to ride a horse, and shoot a bow. A bright smile lit up Carlos's face. The brother boasted that he was considered the best archer in the north. Therefore, he was ready to help the squirrel learn everything that he knew. At any time convenient for the squirrel, he could give her a few lessons. It wasn't often that Birdie got to see his brother in such high spirits. He simply changed before his eyes. If only his brother would always remain so cheerful and good-natured. Perhaps he should ask him more often about martial arts. They were both so excited by the conversation that they heard a strange hissing sound behind them, and only when Birdie looked up she saw a huge, scary snake behind her brother. The girl only managed to shout to Carlos about the danger behind him. Carlos reacted instantly. He drew his sword and without losing a second began to chop down the vile, huge snake. There was not a drop of fear in his eyes. Their color simply became an even more saturated yellow. After a few minutes, which Birdie spent with her eyes closed and her whole body shaking, everything instantly became quiet. The eerie hissing was no longer audible. Opening her eyes, the squirrel realized that Carlos had defeated the snake. A minute later, the brother ran up to the baby and examined her carefully. He was worried, asked if everything was okay with Birdie because she was afraid of blood. But everything was fine with the baby. At that moment, Birdie realized that she was very worried about Carlos. She ran up to him and hugged him tightly. The little girl was very afraid that the snake would simply eat her brother. The guy hadn't felt such a surge of tender feelings for a long time. He smiled and tried to calm the squirrel down. He said that defeating the snake was easy and simple. He was even a little disappointed that his opponent was so weak. The Duke crouched down a little to be on the same level as the little girl and asked her not to be afraid of anything. As long as he was next to her, she was in no danger at all. He would destroy all her enemies, big and small. The brother and sister came out to a beautiful large clearing. There was a lot of space and light here. They could calmly rest and even take a little nap. Squirrel thought that it would be nice to catch her breath and calm down. For some reason, she remembered the boy she had met in the middle of the forest, who had helped her a lot. He was very taciturn, but he was certainly kind to her. Verti never understood then where he had disappeared to. While the girl was thinking about the past, Carlos had already prepared a warm blanket and laid it on the grass. She could lie down and even sleep a little. Brother showed all his care for the little girl. Brother even covered the baby up to keep her warm, and Bertie was incredibly grateful to him for that. She immediately began to feel sleepy. It was quite a day. It would have been nice to even get a few hours of sleep. Carlos himself noticed that the little girl gets tired very quickly. Perhaps it is because of her age. Plus, she is very tiny. Therefore, the guy tried to do everything possible to restore his sister's strength. The young duke leaned over the squirrel and even tried to sing something like a lullaby for her. Bertie couldn't believe that her brother had come all this way just to be with her for a little while and help her relax and calm down. There were many rumors about the Aslan's harsh discipline on the continent. Some said that the lions threw their children off cliffs. They also said that they only left the strongest offspring. People, of course, believed these tales. In fact, no one ever threw their children anywhere, but parents sent them into battle. At the age when other children play with wooden weapons, the heirs of the Aslan family were already going out onto the battlefield with real swords. The North was a very harsh land. Therefore, those who were lucky enough to be born here were much stronger than other clans. All the inhabitants of the North, from children to old men, understood and accepted this order of things. Fortunately or not, Carlos Aslan's fate was not so bad. His enemies trembled with fear at the sight of him. His servants were constantly wary of him. Strong people were always treated like that here. They were feared and respected. The cruel, cold North made no exceptions for anyone. The children of the dukes were little different from the commoners because everyone had been tested by war. But then this sweet red-haired girl appeared, and everything changed. Carlos understood perfectly well what impression he made on those around him. Absolutely everyone was afraid of him, but not the little squirrel. She looked at her brother with wide-open eyes and did not even think of looking away. The young duke watched his little sister sleep peacefully. He didn't leave her side for a minute, and then the squirrel woke up. Her stomach was growling from hunger, and Carlos had to solve this problem. It turned out that her brother was not only brave, but also very prudent. He knew that they would be in the forest for a long time, so he took some delicious milk chocolate with him. Now this delicacy came in very handy. The girl didn't notice how only one piece remained from the whole chocolate bar, and only then did she remember that her brother hadn't eaten anything since the morning either. She felt very ashamed, and Bertie handed the rest of the treat to the boy. He smiled and politely declined the chocolate. Carlos was also terribly hungry, but the girl had a hearty breakfast in the morning, so he would hold out until dinner without any problems, and they would already have dinner at home, so there were no problems. Bertie remembered the stranger she had met in the forest again. Then the guy had also offered her some tasty cookies, but she, either because of hunger or greed, had not shared them either. Now history was repeating itself. On the way, Bertie saw a growing tuberosum. Well, the girl wanted to treat her brother to something more delicious. And so, after walking a few meters, the girl saw a huge walnut tree. Without thinking twice, Bertie decided to turn into a squirrel. This way she could quickly climb a tree, collect tasty nuts, and treat the duke with them. This solution seemed ideal to her, so the next minute her outfit was already lying on the ground. Everything happened so quickly that Carlos didn't even have time to figure out where the little girl had run off to and what she was going to do. And just a few minutes later, the squirrel put a whole handful of choice nuts in the guy's palms. Carlos even felt a little awkward. This little fluffy baby tried especially for him. It was very pleasant and a little embarrassing. That's why the guy's cheeks turned slightly red. It was so sweet that Carlos could hardly hold back the tears that were welling up in his eyes. He leaned over and sincerely thanked Squirrel. He would probably keep these nuts as a souvenir. The boy smiled and took the baby by her fluffy, soft cheeks. She was so cute. How good it was that he had a little sister. This girl melted a whole block of ice in his cold heart. The Duke did this purely out of gentle good intentions, but Bertie was not used to trusting people, so she looked askance at the guy. Maybe he wanted to lull her vigilance with such actions. Carlos saw that the little girl was very angry, but he couldn't help himself. His hands were reaching out to touch little Squirrel. He finally had the opportunity to take care of someone. On the battlefield, he saw countless enemies dying in terrible agony, but this fact had never bothered the guy before, but now he had become somehow overly sentimental. Carlos is also not used to the fact that someone can take care of him. His whole life was connected with war. And then this cute, fluffy creature appears and turns everything upside down. And the young Duke also realized that what he felt towards this girl was not just sympathy or affection. He now knew exactly what this feeling was. Carlos simply loved his little sister. The boy could have bet his head that Squirrel also had warm feelings for him. Even though she tried to seem like a little nasty thing, he leaned even lower and told the little girl that he would never abandon her. The brother and sister returned home towards evening. There was general bustle in the castle. When asked what had happened, the maid replied that the Duke was expecting a very important guest, so everyone was preparing for his arrival. The girl thought that this was indeed a very important person, since he was not received the same way as Viscountess Farina. This meant that the Duke had friends after all, or some good relatives whom the girl did not know. Perhaps Bertie would do best to hide somewhere far away until the guest left the castle walls. Her father would be embarrassed to introduce her to strangers. He would be ashamed to have such a child. She remained an outcast her entire short life. Before the girl's resurrection, the Duke never invited her to his castle, and even now he persistently tries to bring her back to the capital. The girl was so lost in thought, wandering alone through the winter garden, that she did not immediately notice that her aunt, Viscountess Farina, was waiting for her at the end of the alley. An evil smile played on her face, and this did not please the girl. Bertie felt that this meeting was not accidental, so she asked the woman directly why she was looking for her. The aunt, with the same sarcastic smile, said that she really wanted to introduce the little girl to one of her acquaintances. Then the woman looked back and called her wolves to her. According to Farina, they had to meet one escaped rat, and apparently this rat was Balachka. The girl remembered very well how her aunt had set these dogs on her in the capital, and it had been terrible. Bertie froze in place and began to tremble all over. History was repeating itself. Now these creatures would start biting her. Farina watched the situation and chuckled. So she took revenge on Balachka for her disgrace in the presence of the servants, and now the dogs need to sniff the naughty little girl to find her if she wants to run away again. The dogs began to slowly approach the girl, and she in turn began to scream at them not to touch her. The situation seemed simply hopeless, and Bertie closed her eyes tightly in fear. But then something strange happened. Suddenly the dogs fell silent, and then began to whine pitifully. When the little girl opened her eyes, she saw in front of her the same stranger she had recently met in the forest. Try as she might, the Viscountess could not bring her dogs back into the attack. They ran to her feet with guilty and frightened looks and began to whine and tremble with terror. The boy turned to Bertie and calmly informed her that there was no longer any danger. She could calm down and continue her walk. Then he asked her why she was afraid of dogs, and the little girl was speechless from surprise. And the next moment Carlos appeared out of nowhere and stood between Bertie and the stranger. The Duke shouted at him not to go near his sister. Bertie realized that the two knew each other. As it turned out later, this stranger was the important guest who was expected at Leonhardt's castle. The Duke himself came out to the threshold to meet the man. Seeing that Carlos was holding the guest on the threshold, Leonhardt invited him inside. The Duke of the North immediately realized that there was some tension between the young people, but he could not understand the reason why Carlos was angry and looked nervously at the guest. Leonhardt decided to sort out the situation. Carlos angrily replied that he was not going to play the role of a servant and personal guide. Besides, he would not tolerate a guest pestering his little sister. If he was a guest, he should behave accordingly. Leonhardt looked at the guest in such a way that he felt uneasy. The guy had never felt death so close, even in the most terrible battle. He was even afraid to raise his eyes and looked at the Duke. But after a moment of silence, the stranger decided to explain. He said that there had been a misunderstanding. He did not want to pester Balachka, but only decided to help her, since the woman had set the dogs on the little girl. And the guy pointed his finger at Farina, who was standing nearby. The Duke was used to solving problems quickly, so he immediately asked the Viscountess if their guest was telling the truth. The woman began to wriggle out of it, but she was not very successful. Perhaps this woman is simply bored with life, or is looking for a quick death. So Leonhardt can arrange it for her right now. But then the man changed his mind and ordered the guards to drive the relative out of the castle right now. Farina couldn't calm down and kept trying to find an excuse for herself. She shouted that she hadn't planned to scare the girl. She thought that Balachka really liked puppies. She called her bloodthirsty guard dogs puppies. The Duke thought to himself that his poor daughter must have had a hard time in the Viscountess's house. She had suffered enough abuse, but he would stop it. How could he ever trust such a terrible woman with his child? This is the second time this week that the girl has to thank a stranger for saving her life. He always shows up at the right moment. He must be her guardian angel. Suddenly, Balachka's father and brother stood in front of her. They blocked the boy's access to the girl. Then the Duke ordered the guest in an icy voice to move 10 steps away from the girl, and Carlos decided that it would be better to move 30. The girl felt very hurt for her savior. He was a guest, so why were they yelling at him like that? Besides, he had saved her from the dogs, and even earlier from starvation in the forest, and now they wouldn't even let her stand next to Bertie. Then the girl suddenly heard her stranger called a prince. That was news. And what country was he a prince of? And if he had such a title, why didn't his father allow him to approach Bertie? In their kingdom there were only 2 princes. She knew one of them very well, the traitor Ritter. But he had an older half-brother whom the girl had never seen. If you put it all together and use logic, it wasn't hard to guess that the mysterious stranger was Ritter's half-brother. What a surprise. This turn of events could not but please the girl. This boy is the first prince, the one whom Ritter despises and hates so much, that is, the enemy of her enemy, who is her friend. And then a great idea came to the little girl's head. It would be a sin not to take advantage of such an acquaintance. If she and the prince formed an alliance, they would be able to defeat Ritter with one blow. It would be a great way to get revenge. The stranger continued to feel the angry glances of the Duke and his son. He expected that he would not be welcome in the north, but he imagined it a little differently. Carlos even threatened to kill him. As the first prince, he was supposed to come north to express gratitude to Duke Aslan for his military exploits, and the boy was also supposed to convey congratulations on behalf of the entire royal family. But coming to the north empty-handed was considered bad form, so the guy gave the Duke a whole chest of gold as a gift. After all, a lot of money had been spent on wars. But the Duke in turn decided to thank the first prince. As it turned out, this daredevil with his army arrived to help right on the battlefield and provided quite a lot of help during the war. Now Bertie understood how the two knew each other. They had fought bravely together on the battlefield against enemies. And as it turned out, the first prince was also a very brave warrior. The king ordered his son to go north and stay there until the Duke in turn thanked the first prince for his help in the battle, and this was a great humiliation for the boy. The boy clearly decided for himself that his father hated him because of this action of the king. For some reason, he did not send his favorite Ritter to the north. He has to do all the dirty and humiliating work in the kingdom. But in the end, the boy was glad that he had come to the north. He had not expected that in this land he would meet a squirrel. After all, according to his information, she was supposed to be in the capital with her aunt. And since that's the case, he'll try to spend as much time with this fluffy little thing as possible. And by the way, now would be a good time to visit Bertie. And the poor squirrel, overwhelmed by the emotions and impressions of the day, was tossing and turning in her bed and couldn't fall asleep. Hundreds of thoughts overwhelmed her. Why did the first principal appear in the north? And why does Carlos hate it so much? The next moment, the girl heard strange sounds on the street. Someone was calling her a star and asking her to go out onto the balcony. Curiosity won out, and she decided to see who was calling her late at night. The birth of the first prince of Arthel was not blessed. The reason was that the boy was born an anamorphic dragon. That is, he was a creature capable of transforming from a human into an animal and back. Even in unions between two animorphs, dragons were born very rarely. But here, some magic happened, and instead of a snakeling, the king gave birth to a dragon. It was strange and shameful at the same time. The queen mother initially disliked the boy. She was waiting for the wise and cunning snake. But in the end, the higher powers punished her, and she gave birth to a dragon. Therefore, the boy never knew what true motherly love is. In addition to the fact that the boy had bright yellow eyes, which is not typical for their family, he also had black hair. All the other children had white hair. Therefore, the boy was an outcast from childhood. Artel was hated simply for being there. The king and queen asked the child not to even raise his eyes to them because it irritated the parents terribly. Therefore, the boy tried not to show himself in public once again and spent most of his time in his room studying. The parents were most irritated by their son's bright yellow eyes. In order to avoid the child's gaze forever, the king ordered him to wear a black bandage and thus forever protect himself from the child's piercing gaze. But the boy was still small and often disobeyed the king's orders. He could not stay in the bandage for a long time, and he wanted to learn and study the world around him. He was always scolded for disobedience. The king didn't believe the rumors that the darker the color of the eyes of an animorph, the more power he had. But because of the energy emitted by the eyes of his eldest son, he was losing his personal authority, and this infuriated him terribly. Unlike Artel, Ritter was a true favorite of the royal family. His mother adored him, his father was proud of him, and the servants carried him around in their arms. The boy grew up spoiled and very mean. Father, mother, and even all the servants in the palace were panicky, afraid of Artel's gaze, and they tried to distance little Ritter from his brother. The boy should not look the elder prince in the eye. Over time, the boy got used to the bandage and was even happy to wear it. Only in this form were people not afraid of him. They talked to him, and even some servants felt a little sorry for him, but not his parents. They demonstratively despised him. Time passed. The boy grew up. He wanted more and more to find a person in this world who could look into his yellow eyes without fear. He felt an urgent need for this. At times, when Artel felt particularly heavy at heart, he turned into a dragon and circled above the city. Only in the sky did he feel free and could remain himself. No one could see his eyes from such a height. In the royal palace, he felt very sad, lonely, and uncomfortable. But when the boy was flying high in the sky, he could forget about everything for a while, especially about the terrible insults of his parents. The advantage of the amorphous dragon was that it could hide in thick clouds and fly freely unnoticed by people. No one saw it, but it could see absolutely everything that was happening on the streets of the capital. One day, casting very low over the houses, the crew saw an open window, and in it a small, pretty girl with red hair. She was sad. The little girl was very lightly dressed and could catch a cold. Artel thought it would be a good idea to disperse the strong wind with his wings and thus drive the girl inside the room, away from the window. But the girl turned out to be too curious. The boy was so carried away that he didn't realize how he flew too fast to the window. Then he heard the girl addressing him and calling him Mr. Star. She must have confused the boy's yellow eyes with stars. The girl began to smile, and this could not but please the dragon. The little girl asked him to come down even closer, said that he had very beautiful eyes, and she really wanted to take a closer look at them. They were shining like stars. The dragon wanted to cry with happiness at that moment. For the first time in his life, someone noticed his eyes and said that they were very beautiful. Could this little creature really see something good in him? For the first time in his life, the boy heard kind words addressed to him. For the first time, no one ran away from him, but on the contrary, asked him to come closer, and these were not his parents or brother, but a complete stranger. The prince decided to approach the window. Just in case, he asked the girl if she was afraid of him, because he looked a little strange. But she answered that he was very nice, and she was not afraid at all. The guy gathered his courage and decided to ask the girl for something. He would be very pleased if the little girl allowed him to call her a star. After all, in his eyes, she always shines brightly. The little girl was slightly surprised. After all, it was she who came up with the idea of calling the dragon a star, and now he was asking for the same thing. So how would they decide? If they were both stars, there would be confusion. The guy was slightly embarrassed. Indeed, it was strange, he hadn't even thought about it. After a minute of thought, the dragon asked to call him by his name, that is, Artel. And now, after a long time, he sees the girl again. Now she is not standing in the window opening, but on a beautiful balcony in her father's castle. He calls her Little Star and asks her to call him Artel. But this time everything turned out completely differently than the naive prince expected. The little girl started screaming, calling him a liar and a traitor. Why did he even come to her? The guy was embarrassed, and for the first few minutes he didn't even know what to say. Then he reminded the squirrel that he was still the same dragon she had become friends with. He just couldn't come to her for a very long time. It turns out that even earlier, the little girl had asked Ritter about dragons in detail. She told him that a strange dark cloud in the form of a dragon and very beautiful bright eyes visited her. Birdie also told the prince that she and the dragon had a lot in common. The boy looked away, thought for a moment, and said that it was he who visited her at night in the form of a dragon. He even came up with a fancy story about the strange cloud being a magical disguise. If he were to wander around in the form of a snake, everyone would guess that he was the king's son, Ritter. Then the girl was happy to hear these words from the prince. He is so wonderful and always tries to surprise her. The trick with the dragon is very interesting. It turns out that Ritter has a wonderful imagination. Every day the prince methodically repeated the words to the little girl. He said that he was Birdie's only friend and, at the same time, her future husband. And the little girl blindly believed his words. And now, standing alone on the balcony, Birdie was angry that she thought it was Ritter who had flown to her. The last person she wanted to see was this vile deceiver. She told the dragon once again to leave nicely, otherwise she would be forced to call her father and brother into the room, and then the prince would definitely be in trouble. At best, he would be left without wings. Finally, the gang understood why the girl was so angry. She thinks that his younger brother Ritter is stalking her, and how to convince her that it is not him. The task seems difficult. The guy decided to play it straight and not hide anything, so he asked the girl to listen to him. He is not who she thinks he is. Ritter is far away from here in the capital. He would definitely be afraid to fly here. The girl was very surprised to hear these words. She stopped and turned back to the dragon. Was he telling the truth? Probably yes. Ritter really was very timid. He would not dare to appear in the north. She had read in books before that an antimorph was a dragon that could communicate with people even in its monster form. But it behaved completely differently than she did as a squirrel. Why Ritter lied to her when she told him about the dragon's visits? He is an unimaginably mean guy, and he certainly had good reasons to deceive the girl. But now it is worth finding out what exactly. The dragon exhaled a little and gradually calmed down. He would not lose his favorite star. They were in the north now, and it was here that she got the name Birdie. It suits her madly. Then the little girl asked a question. How did it happen that the dragon also ended up in the north? What is he doing here? After all, he used to live in the capital. Maybe there is some kind of catch here too. Antimorph replied that he had come north to Duke Aslan with the first prince. He was his assistant. Therefore, they would be able to meet with the starlet in the evenings, since it was problematic to do so during the day. The squirrel was a little upset that she wouldn't be able to see her friend when it was light outside, but there was no other way. At least in the evening she would enjoy the company of a creature that was pleasant to her. Birdie told the dragon that she had seen the first prince of Arthel during the day. He seemed a little arrogant and a little mysterious. He was also very concerned about his reputation. The little girl continued to share her impressions with the dragon. She thought that this guy looked a bit like Playboy. He looked simply amazing and attracted everyone's attention. She was no exception. And the girl also admitted that at their first meeting the gang called her a lady, and she liked it madly. It turned out that on top of everything else, he was also polite. This prince is not at all like Ritter. They chatted a little more, and the dragon noticed that the girl was getting sleepy. She was very tired today. He knew it very well, so the dragon said that he urgently needed to fly, wished the little girl good night, and disappeared. As soon as Artel had flown away, an angry and furious Carlos appeared on the threshold of her room. He went inside and looked around. It seemed that the Duke was looking for someone. He probably decided that he would see the first prince of the kingdom here. To his surprise, the girl was alone and had been in bed for a long time. She asked her brother why he was still awake and why he had come to her at such an hour. He answered sheepishly that he had simply dropped in to wish the squirrel good night. Carlos sat by the little girl's bed for a while longer. He stroked her fluffy hair and warned her that if she saw a guy with dark hair and yellow eyes, she should definitely ignore him. She shouldn't talk to him. Birdie herself could not understand why her brother was behaving so strangely. Maybe because he had never cared before. He was very worried that no one would harm this fluffy little girl. The next morning was just as noisy. All the servants were bustling about the house. Birdie asked around and learned that the Duke was preparing a grand banquet to celebrate the victory of his army. Indeed, how could she forget about such a celebration? Both the Duke and his army deserved to have a banquet in their honor and rejoice at the end of a long war. Should she really be allowed to come? Knowing her father, she didn't really expect to be invited to the victory celebration, but the maids told her that there would be guests from the capital, so everything had to be prepared to the highest standard. It turned out that before the war, Duke Leonhard also held a grand ball, and there were also guests from the capital. They criticized the event and called it rustic. And then Balachka was handed a beautiful envelope containing an invitation to tea. Could it be that she had waited, and the Duke would introduce her to the guests as his own daughter, and Carlos would tell everyone that she was his sister? Only a minute later, after carefully reading the text of the letter, the little girl realized that Prince Artel was inviting her for a cup of tea. They would drink tea only together, and it was too exciting. Birdie decided to accept the invitation and went to meet the prince. But as soon as she entered the living room, Carlos immediately came running. His face expressed obvious displeasure. Artel reminded her that he had only invited a young lady. The young duke started shouting that it was not customary to drink tea here, and he insistently asked not to call his sister a lady, and it would be best if the prince did not speak to her at all. That way everyone would be calmer. Artel smiled mysteriously and said that even in war, Carlos was not so sensitive. He changed a lot after returning from the battlefield. And, by the way, the prince never approached the lady first. But the Duke was unapproachable in his desire to protect his tail from this terrible guy. Yes, the prince is certainly very handsome, but let the maids admire this beauty, and not his fluffy sister. The prince smiled again. He did not want to develop the conflict. That is why he said that he named the girl that way simply from the bottom of his heart. After all, he has no one, and he would so like to have a sister like Carlos. Birdie thought. What about his younger brother Ritter? Was the prince at odds with his relatives, since he said he had no one? But the king and queen were alive and well in the royal palace. What was going on? But on the other hand, it's even good. If he can't get along with his brother, then they really can unite and act against Ritter. Then the truth will prevail, and the traitors will be exposed. Carlos was terribly angry with his sister. He had asked her to ignore this guy. But the little girl said that she couldn't do that to His Highness. After all, he could help her carry out her plan for revenge. Artel sat and listened to the Duke's grumbling, but tried not to react to it in any way. He had completely different plans. He approached the girl and asked permission to kiss her little hand. Birdie suddenly felt as if her brother might just explode with anger. He turned red as a tomato and clenched his fists. Why did these men always want to resolve conflicts with force and shouting? She decided to intervene immediately, otherwise these two crazy people would definitely fight. She asked her brother to calm down a bit and leave the prince alone, to which he only snapped, but still moved away from the guy. Verite continued. She said that she would very much like to hear the real name of the first prince. After all, that was why he sent her the invitation letter. Now she is waiting for an answer. Carlos could barely control himself. He looked menacingly at the prince and said that he only expected a name from him. After that, the king's son must leave the house, otherwise he would not vouch for himself. The prince nodded, walked over to Birdie and dropped to one knee. He looked the girl in the eye and said that his name was Artel Oz Astrum. Then he took the little girl's hand and shook it tenderly. Birdie thought about it. The name was very familiar to her. She had heard that the first prince's mother was from the royal family of the eastern continent. Perhaps the prince got his name there. That's why it seemed familiar to her. At this time, Duke Leonhardt called Viscountess Farina to his office again. He needed to get something from the woman, from the royal family. She brought medicine for the child, so why doesn't she give it to him? The woman confirmed that she really had to give the Duke the medicine for the baby. With it, her niece would not get weak every winter. This medicine was prepared for Bertie by the royal physician himself. This was the elixir of His Highness the Second Prince, who possesses the power of Animorph. As is known, the Serpent of Noble Wisdom possesses the poison of retribution, which can be made into a healing potion. Leonhardt no longer trusted this vile deceiver. She does nothing for nothing. So the Duke asked what the Viscountess wanted in return, but she answered that she did it out of love for the squirrel and loyalty to the kingdom. Then Farina decided to take her leave quickly so as not to blab too much. She wished the Duke luck, said that she would be glad if her niece survived the local winter without problems. Duke Leonhardt lowered his head and thought deeply. Why was this woman so concerned about her niece? She hated her. The situation seemed strange and slightly funny. If everything the Viscountess says were true, she would have given the elixir to the baby immediately upon arriving north. But the woman does this only after she is thrown out of the castle. Something is wrong here. Farina continued to lie meanly. She said that she had heard that it was necessary to wait until the night, when the constellation of the snake would shine, for the medicine to work. Now that this day had almost arrived, she was giving the medicine away. Be that as it may, the most important thing for the Duke was the health of his daughter. But he needed to be sure. The elixir would not harm the squirrel. But on the other hand, apart from the royal medicine, they had no other. The Viscountess confirmed that the medicine had no side effects. She said that the girl would not experience any physical changes, but the woman simply kept silent about something else. There will be changes, but of a completely different nature. The conversation continued in the living room. Bertie asked the prince why he still couldn't take off the bandage from his face. She would so like to see his eyes. Even in the middle of the forest, he remains blindfolded. When the girl realized what was going on, she was very surprised. It turns out that the eyes of the Animorph terrify ordinary people. He can intimidate his enemies just by looking at them. That's why Artel took off the bandage only on the battlefield. And the little girl also remembered that when Auntie set her dogs on her, the gang dispersed them without doing anything. He simply took off the blindfold and looked the chained dogs in the eyes. The young people walked through the castle. Servants bustled around. Bertie informed her brother and the prince that the Duke was preparing to organize a huge victory banquet. This time, they must not fall flat on their faces. Everything would be top-notch. Suddenly, the girl thought she heard her aunt's voice. Bertie ran to the railing and looked down. Farina was standing in the middle of the living room, talking to the maid. She was complaining to the man about the way the locals were treating her. The Viscountess decided that everything in the north looks rustic, only because there is no normal housewife here. Well, there is no choice. She will have to take on this important role, and she will definitely cope with it. She turned to the maid and demanded in a commanding tone that he bring her a list of the banquet preparations, but he apologized and said that no records of the Aslan family would be given to strangers, even if they were relatives. When the woman refused to show the tapes for the second time, Farina decided to hit her. She had already raised her hand, but did not have time to strike. Bertie stood in front of her and in the same commanding tone ordered the aunt to lower her hand. The Viscountess simply seethed with anger. How dare this little rat speak out against her? The stupid niece imagined herself the mistress of this house, but she would not allow herself to be mocked any longer and would show everyone who the Viscountess was. The woman decided that since she couldn't hit the maid, she would take out all her anger on her niece and beat her. But suddenly her gaze stopped on two young people. Behind her stood the young Duke and Prince Artel. These two, each in their own way, tried with all their might to protect Bertie. This was especially evident in the prince. When he saw the girl, his gaze became simply unbearable. He could kill just by looking at a person. But for some reason the boys decided not to interfere. The prince assumed that the squirrel was not so weak that she could not cope with such a nonsense situation, so these two decided to just watch from the sidelines. The evil Viscountess decided to teach the girl proper manners again. She began to tell her that the North had a bad influence on the little girl and that she was forgetting the manners she had been taught in the capital, but Bertie did not even listen to these stupid words. The girl came even closer to the woman and asked who taught the Viscountess manners. After all, mocking a small child is very bad, and not at all in line with cultural behavior. Even before Bertie's resurrection, Auntie had been obsessed with decorum, dignity, and elegance. So it was not difficult to embarrass her now. She would not tolerate a single stain on her aristocratic name.